Hello, everyone. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Welcome back. Welcome back. Thank you for those who stayed behind, and then those who are already watching online. May God bless you. And then we're gonna start, and we have a few people outside and maybe downstairs as well. As we beginning, they probably gonna start make their way up here today. And then here we are. We're starting a little early. We're starting maybe 15 minutes early. And if you happen to be online, and we know we said 2 o'clock, but this is for you. Maybe you'll have enough time to share some stories, right? Thank you so much. Thank you so much. So we're not going to take too much time talking. We're just going to go right into the presentation. And remember, let me say this to those who happen to be watching online. You see in the comment, it says place your any questions that you have there on the live chat. If you have any questions, you can please place it in the chat. Then that question will be directed back to Dr. Baker Jr. And then anyone who have questions in here too, hold on to your questions, write it down so you don't forget it. And at the end of the presentation, he's gonna give you a few minutes to talk, and you'll be able to ask any questions that you feel comfortable with. All right? So before we begin, let's just bow our heads with a word of prayer. Father God in heaven, here we are again, trying to know more about the history of the Bible and what you have done in the past. And that what you are doing now, and we believe what you're going to continue on doing in our lives. So we please ask that you give us a receptive heart to understand and be able to put them to practice as knowledge. Thank you, Father God, for your presence in our church. In Jesus' name we pray, amen. Brothers and sisters, with you, Dr. L. Scotty Baker Jr. Thank you.
Well, welcome to Archaeology, the Exodus. I am L.S. Baker Jr., and today we're going to answer the question we asked last night, which was, last night we had a couple of different possibilities for when the Hebrews came into Egypt, one of which allowed them to be in Egypt during the Middle Kingdom, when pyramids were still being built. And so we asked the question, would they have even been able to see pyramids? And the answer to that will have to be answered by the answer to the question, where did Israel live in Egypt? I'm going to start off with a quote. This is actually a quote from one of the kings of Egypt who lived down at Thebes. They didn't call it Thebes. Thebes, of course, is the Greek term for it. It actually is the term Waset. That's what they called it. And he said, "Why do I contemplate my strength while there is one great man in Avaris and another in Cush, sitting united with an Asiatic and a Nubian, while each man possesses his slice of Egypt?" This took place during the Second Intermediate period. I'll tell you his story actually in a few minutes, but it's one of those times where there's multiple kings ruling at the same time. And so his complaint was, there's somebody in the north, there's the Nubians in the south, and I'm stuck in the middle, and it should all be mine, but now I have to share it with these guys. These guys are plotting against me. So we'll talk about his story here in a little bit. I'll show you a picture. A pastor shared a little bit last night, and I said a few things about it, but I'm part of a project at Karnak. So every December, I get a chance to go to Egypt, and while I'm in Egypt, we're part of the Great Hypostyle Hall. If you see a picture of Egypt, almost always you see these big, giant columns. That's the Great Hypostyle Hall of the Temple of Amun at Karnak, and I'm just part of that project. I'm just actually outside of that hall, and I'm part of a team from Memphis who works on this. I'm actually part of a subgroup from Lipscomb University, and we're actually working on this entire wall. I think I'm going to show you that picture, a better picture of it, in the next presentation at 3 o'clock, or whenever we start the next one. And I'm actually right here working this middle section. This middle section is a Hittite treaty. It's a treaty between Ramses and of Egypt, the second Ramses the Great, and the king of the Hittites. And my job is to actually look at these and read the hieroglyphs all the way down on these 30-some lines of text. And you see there's damage everywhere, and I'm trying to sort out what actually is a hieroglyph and what isn't, because we're taking high-resolution images. And we need somebody who can read the hieroglyphs to be able to say this is a hieroglyph and this is a scratch or a damage. And so that's what I'm doing, and I'm using a mirror, a little hand mirror with light that's casting raking light across the surface to help me kind of see the hieroglyphs a little bit better. And so that's what I get to do every December, and I'm excited about that. So I'll show you another picture again a little later. Okay, so we'll start off with the hippopotamus pool and this question. But to do that, we started with building on last night, which was the foundation of when were the Hebrews in Egypt. This was the Egyptian history, and we decided that there's three different possibilities, three different theories. All three theories, two of them are considered 1 Kings 6:1 to be literal, and that places the Exodus event in the New Kingdom during the 18th dynasty. The 1 Kings 6:1 that you see that 480 years is symbolic, puts it in the 19th dynasty. We'll tell you why in the next presentation. But then what makes them really different is that the first one and the third one see the 430 years from Exodus 12 as all being in Egypt, while the middle one sees it as 430 years in Egypt and Canaan. And so this is the one that I believe. I'm being very transparent, but I have friends who believe this, and I have friends who believe this. The colleagues at Andrews are here, and I have some colleagues from Lipscomb University that I work with at Karnak that believe that one, and we have fun conversations with each other about these, and I'll tell you why I think this one here matters more than when they came in, but we'll talk about all that. So we're going to answer some of these questions, date and chronology today, by answering the question, when were the Hebrews in Egypt? But to start that, I'm going to ask you a question. What directions do all rivers flow? Downhill, right, yeah. So I was in a geography class at Oklahoma State University, and the geography teacher asked the question, and of course I'm thinking, well, the Amazon goes this way, Mississippi goes this way, the Nile goes this way, what in the world are you talking about? And then somebody said downhill, and I thought, okay, of course. So some of you guys are much smarter than I was. Yes, the answer, of course, is downhill. All rivers flow downhill. And that's important because understanding what about Egypt, the Nile flows south to north. So it's flowing south to north. What does that mean about Egypt? Where's the high ground? It's in the south, right? So it's in the south. And so to talk about this, so here we have the map of Egypt, this very long, narrow Nile River Valley that goes down into modern Sudan, but in the Kush area. And then at the top here, you have this little it flattens out, and it kind of branches out and became this kind of marshland. This is north, but uphill is going south. And so Egypt was actually two lands. The Egyptians themselves called it two lands. In fact, the Hebrew word Mitzrayim actually is a plural ending, indicating multiple lands. They're actually two lands. One is Upper Egypt, and that would be the one that's uphill, and the other one is Lower Egypt, which is downhill. And they actually had these two little, symbols that kind of the sedge plant that represents Lower Egypt, the Upper Egypt, and the bee, which represents Lower Egypt. And so it says Nesud Biti, and that kind of introduces, that means the king of Upper and Lower Egypt. And then Keper Enre, that's the name of the king in this particular hieroglyph. So Upper Egypt, they had a crown. The crown was this white kind of bowling pin looking thing on their head. And so you see them here. It's being worn on the head here. It's also being worn, it's the artistic drawing, but here you can see actually on a tomb painting. This is at Tutankhamun's tomb, this little image of Tutankhamun, and he's wearing it. So the king of Upper Egypt, the Nile Valley. The Nile Valley actually had a protectress, and the protectress was Nekbet, the vulture goddess. And so you can see her right here, Nekbet, the vulture goddess, wearing that crown. Wadjet, the cobra goddess, was the protector of Lower Egypt, which is the delta in the north. And you can see this is a red crown. You see it wearing over here. You can see it also right here on the head of, I think this is Seti. I can't remember. I think it's Seti. But over here you see Tutankhamun wearing that crown as well. So Tutankhamun has two different wooden images, gilded wooden images, and one of them showing he's the king of Upper Egypt, one Lower Egypt. And so even Egypt had all this iconography that really showed that it was two lands. We showed you the Narmer palette last night. And here you can see, I showed you last night, told you about it, but here you see Narmer with the white crown of Upper Egypt and the red crown of Lower Egypt. When they combine these two together, it looks like this, an artist's drawing, but this is actually from Karnak, one of the pillars, and you can see the king here wearing that crown of both of them. All right, so unified Egypt. Egypt was unified, that those two crowns were unified into one crown in all the gold periods, the early dynastic, all three kingdoms in the late period, were all times that there was one king ruling all of Egypt. The story of the hippopotamus pool happens during the second intermediate period. The second intermediate period, no matter which theory you believe, no matter whether you believe that 430 years was all in Egypt and 1 Kings 6:1 is literal, which means the Exodus took place here, which means 430 years earlier puts you back here in the Middle Kingdom, that they still were in Egypt during the second intermediate period. They were just there a little bit longer. The other two theories also have them in during the second intermediate period. They just leave at a different period of time, 18th or 19th dynasty. So all of them are in Egypt during the story I'm going to tell you. So this story takes place during the time when the Hebrews were actually in Egypt. Where in Egypt, we're going to answer a little later. But the story is that there was this Middle Kingdom ended with the 13th dynasty. It was the first part of the 13th dynasty. And during that period of time, some Asiatic people, the people that came from the southern Levant area, moved in with these weapons, I'll show you, and they pushed the Egyptians south. 13th dynasty became 16th dynasty. And but just so that you know who Asiatics are, my wife is always reminding me, I use the term Asiatic. She's like, Scotty, you got to tell people what Asiatic mean. Asiatic is just a term. It's the Egyptian word amu, apuru. It just means Hebrew. It means anybody who is in that land, in the area of the lands in southern Palestine area. In fact, this is actually from a tomb in Beni Hassan that was done during the Middle Kingdom of some Hebrews or some Asiatic people coming into Egypt, and this is how they would dress. The men would dress like this. They're obviously princes. They're wearing this kind of very colorful clothes. The women dress like that. They're coming into Egypt. You can see the Egyptians here with their white kilts. Very, very much different. The hairstyles are all different, but you can see the Asiatic people had this unique kind of beard, kind of a beard like this, and the way they're dressed. So anyway, they came and they pushed south. They chased the Egyptians south, and they pushed them. And we don't know, actually, from the archaeological record, what happened to the 16th dynasty. That family disappeared. We don't know. We think they became the 17th dynasty, but we're not 100% sure. But the 15th dynasty, what Manetho, remember from last night, Manetho, the Egyptian priest, called the 15th dynasty, were these Asiatics that came in. They called them the Hyksos. Well, during the 15th dynasty, a king named Kian, not the pepper, but he somehow during his reign he seized all of Egypt far south. And by the way, he seized it because of, in part due to a famine, which is very interesting for a story. But then he ruled peacefully in the north. This for a long time. In the north, the Hyksos ruled this area, and in the south, around Thebes area at Waset, the Egyptians ruled. 16th maybe became 17th. At some point, 17th dynasty took over the southern area. All their native Egyptians. All right, so about 50 years or so, there was peace. We don't know for exactly how long, but there was peace for some time. And eventually a king in the north named Apepi began to rule, and a king in the south named Second Enre Ta'a, this is the second Enre, and the Ta'a began to gain power. And so this is when the story of the hippopotamus pool took place. And this is from the actual inscription in Egypt. And when the messenger of King Apepi, life, prosperity, health, reached the prince of the southern city, he was then taken to the presence of the prince of the southern city. Then one, at second Enre Ta'a, said to the messenger of the king, King Apepi, life, prosperity, health. That's like saying long live the king or something like that. It's little symbols. I'm sure he didn't mean it. Why have you been sent to the southern city? Wherefore have you come journeying here? The messenger then told him, it is King Apepi, life, prosperity, health, who has sent me to you in order to say, let there be a withdrawal from the hippopotamus pool, which lies at the east of the city, because they do not let sleep come to me either in the daytime or at night, for the noise of them is in the citizens' ears. Then the prince of the southern city became stupefied for so long a while that he became unable to render a reply to the messenger of King Apepi, life, prosperity, and health. So what was he complaining about? Well, the Egyptians had, in their religious understanding of things, they assigned anything supernatural was a god, and that included animals. So hippopotami were also animals, and they believed the hippopotami were personifications, manifestations in real life of the god Seth, who was the evil god. And so every year the king who personifies Horus, the living king, would then go and spear and kill a hippopotamus during their ritual celebration of him being king and being able to control the forces of chaos. And so apparently this upset the citizens in the north. But the way they said it as if the sound of you killing hippopotami are not allowing us to sleep. Well, that's 350 miles from the north to the south. That would be like you guys saying here in Duluth, the University of Minnesota is celebrating something so loudly that you can't sleep because of the noise. It's absurd. It's absurd, which is why Second NWA was stupefied for a while. How is it possible that you guys can't get sleep? There's no way you can hear the hippopotami dying. So what it really was is a declaration of war. You're telling us to stop doing our religion. And so I guess the only way to do that is we're going to go to war. So Second NWA advanced north, and Pepe advanced uphill, south, to meet in battle. That battle didn't end well for Second NWA. Sorry about the picture. If you don't want to look at it, just close your eyes. But because the Hyksos had these war chariots. The Egyptians didn't have war chariots. They brought chariots and they brought horses into Egypt. Horses didn't exist in Egypt prior to this period. They also brought these battle axes. This is a ceremonial battle axe. And it looks like Second NWA was killed with a battle axe. There's actually a much more gruesome picture. If you see his whole body, it's contorted quite a bit as he was tied. His elbows tied behind his back and killed. So he didn't live. But his son Kamos, the one I read the quote from earlier, the one who complained, Kamos took over. So he went south and hit, this is a mummy case, his mummy case. He went south and attacked the Nubians as the Nubians were coming, downhill at him. But Kamos was able to defeat them and push them all the way deep into the land of Cush. And then he turned around to meet Pepe. The Great Hyksos War is recorded on this stele. I'm actually standing in it. This is, if you get a chance to visit Egypt and you go to the Luxor Museum, you'll see this the stele. So you kind of get an idea of how big it is compared to a person. It's quite large. This whole battle is kind of described. This whole war is described. Well, Kamos succeeded in pushing Pepe back, all the way back to Avaris in the north, the northern capital. But Kamos also died in battle. We don't know how he died, but he died in battle. So his brother took over. His brother was named Ahmoses. Ahmoses was the last king of the 17th dynasty, but he succeeded in pushing the Hyksos out, and in the process of doing that, he became also the first king of the 18th dynasty. And so Ahmose, in effect, unified the land and began what we call now the New Kingdom, which began with the 18th dynasty. So the Hyksos got pushed out. The Asiatics still existed, and in the north, they existed over here in the Levant area, and they would be a thorn in the side of the Egyptians for many, many years. Ahmose went further south, solidified that border, and the process of doing that had control of both lands, and that began the New Kingdom. And as a process, they made like footstools, and they put these little pictures of the images of all the foreign people under their feet, so the kings could step on their feet. We actually read about that in the Bible, about making your enemies your footstool. This comes from the Egyptians. And they also took these, they made these like canes that you walk with, and they have a Nubian there with the cane, so you can actually see what the Nubians look like. So you can see the different ethnicities of the people who lived in the area. So this was a Nubian, these were Asiatic people, and Egyptians looked quite a bit different. All right, so this whole story took place during the time the Hebrews were in Egypt. But where were they at in Egypt? Well, these two theories consider that they would have been in Egypt close to where the capital city was. The capital city moved in the Middle Kingdom to the second intermediate period. It moved to a different place. In the Middle Kingdom, it's the purple dot here at Lisht. This is where those other pyramids are being built at Lisht. And they're in the Middle Kingdom. I remember some Asiatics did come to Egypt. We saw that Pithem of Beni Hassan. We saw that earlier. So people were coming in from the land of what we call land of Canaan of Palestine. They were coming in. So we know that, but they'd be coming in and traveling all the way down and living close to there. During the second intermediate period, there was two capitals, one in the north and one in the south. During the New Kingdom, these two capitals remained in place. One at Avaris, which is where Pepe was at, and one in Thebes, where Second NWA, Kamos, and Ahmose were at before pushing them out. By the way, there's about 120 miles between these two, about 120 miles, which is quite some distance. All right, so what does the Bible say about where the Hebrews lived? Let's go to the Bible and see. Genesis 45:10. I always like to move, so I'm not standing in somebody's way on one side. Also, my neck doesn't hurt. It says, "You shall dwell in the land of Goshen, and you shall be near to me, you and your children, your children's children, your flocks and your herds, and all that you have." This is what Joseph said to his brothers. He said, "I'm going to move you to Egypt to be near to me." So wherever they lived, it has to be near to one of the administrative capitals we just showed you. Near an administrative center. So what does that mean? But what does near mean? Well, Genesis 46, then he, that's Jacob, Israel, sent Judah before him to Joseph to point out before him the way to Goshen. And they came to the land of Goshen, so Joseph made ready his chariot and went up to Goshen to meet his father Israel. And he presented himself to him and fell on his neck and wept on his neck. So he says, Judah went to get Joseph and show him how to get to Goshen. And when they did that, Joseph read his chariot. Okay, remember, we just said the chariots only came during the second intermediate period, so that gives you a little bit of a clue. But then it says he went up to Goshen, up to Goshen. So what direction is up? North. Oh, not north. Yeah, see, I think of it as north because I grew up in America where all the rivers tend to flow from north to south. So up seems to be uphill, seems to be north. But in Egypt, up is south. So he went up, he went south. So that means that one of these administrative capitals, that means Goshen is south. It's uphill from wherever the administrative capital is. So we have three possibilities. Okay, so near and uphill from the administrative capital, but where at the time of the Exodus? Well, the Exodus fortunately took place during the New Kingdom, all during the New Kingdom. And so this will help us if we can figure out where the capital was at in the New Kingdom. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the transition. We told you about second Enrei already and about Kamos. Both died fighting the Hyksos. Amos took over and he succeeded. That's when the New Kingdom began. The 18th dynasty also begins, even though it's the same family. Large-scale slavery, all three theories agree with this. This is Egyptian archaeology. This isn't from the Bible. Large-scale slavery began under the first Amenhotep. So it's likely that the Hebrews are put into slavery at that point. No matter who you think the Pharaoh was, no matter when you think the Exodus was or what took place, everybody agrees that Amenhotep is probably the one the Bible's talking about when it says put him into slavery. During the time of Hatshepsut and the third Thutmose, 2 store cities were built to supply the military. That's going to be very important because we know where these 2 supply cities are. For the longest time, 100 years or so, Egyptian archaeologists, even ones that don't really care much about the Bible, have been very curious about the location of Pithem and Ramses. And this is actually a triumph of archaeology and the archaeological method, and I'll tell you why. Because originally, if you look at some old Bible maps, you'll see that Ramses is located up here at Tanis, and Pithem is located over here at Tel-Maskuta. And the reason is because in both of these cases, we now know that the cities were I guess, deconstructed, and the building materials were then borrowed and reused. So they reused downriver. This used to be a river that went through here. It's dried up now, but it used to go through here. So when this dried up in this area, they used the building materials down here. And so when the archaeologists came, they found the city of Ramses and thought it was actually here. And now we know that it actually was here. Same thing with Pithem. Pithem was reused, and now we know it's actually here at Tel Aviv. So these are 2 military supply cities. They supplied the militaries on their routes out of Egypt. Is it possible that the Hebrews had anything to do with those 2 building supply cities, and how do we know that archaeologically? So I'll show you. Manfred Bitak actually is a German archaeologist. Not, as far as I know, he doesn't believe in the Bible. I'm pretty sure he's an atheist. But he was at least an agnostic, but I'm pretty sure he's atheist. He's been digging at the Avaris area where the Hyksos lived, where Pepi lived, and for some time, and this is what he's been digging. So you can see here, everything that's green is actually the buildings. This grid mark are these artificial, we call them bulks in archaeology. We have them to control, as controls for the scientific method. And also, as you go down the bulk wall of dirt, you keep the stratigraphy of the dirt layers. So you can see where the ash layers are for cities being burned. We see all kinds of things that way. And underneath it, though, we uncover actual walls. So you see the walls actually here. And so he's discovered the Hyksos Palace there at Tel Adaba, a Canaanite temple, all kinds of things in that area. This is during the time of the second intermediate period. Well, at some time, the Hyksos were pushed out. The Egyptians came in. They lived in the same land. He actually discovered that the Hyksos were pushed out, and there's no destruction layer, which means they left peaceably. They were in the middle of a war, but something must have stagnated to a point where they both kind of said, okay, we're not leaving outside the walls, and the people inside the walls are, we can't live unless you do leave, so let's not fight it out, just let us leave and we'll leave, and they left peaceably. So the Hyksos left peaceably, there's no destruction layer, and the Egyptians lived on that area. So this is a map. This is actually the river at the time went through here. Also, the gray area is a little bit shallower of a river, and actually had a little bit of a harbor in the middle here. And so that harbor is actually this right here, over here. It's kind of a different way of understanding the land area. And so the city of Avaris was on 2 pieces of land, kind of with this channel and a harbor in the middle. And that is where they started building the first one of these supply cities, one of these supply areas to supply the military from this point. In fact, before they started building the palace, they started building the supply city because military was so important, because the Hyksos was still a threat in the Levant area. And so the Egyptians actually ruled from two cities, one in the north at Avaris, and the other one at Thebes in the south. Sometime from the time they gained control of Avaris to the time of Hatshepsut and Thutmose, when they started building that supply city, during sometime the beginning of Amenhotep, the second Amenhotep's reign. The first one, by the way, is the slavery one. He put up people in slavery. Sometime during the second Amenhotep's reign, Avaris was abandoned by the Egyptians. We don't know why it was abandoned. And so they just ruled only from Thebes for a while. And then, so here's it being abandoned. And then I put it up there again so you can see it. All the way through the rest of it, here's Tutankhamun, the famous Tutankhamun. And then you go, by the way, this is Akhenaten, the heretic king, and Tutankhamun. And they get to the end of the 18th dynasty. Horemheb goes back to Avaris, digs out the silt and everything that was there, and tries to reestablish the harbor town, because it was an important harbor town for shipping. I don't think I probably have to tell people in Duluth what shipping means, because it's very important. And so they're trying to reestablish it. Well, the family of Ramses the Great is the second one. The family of Ramses the first lived, that's where they came from. Their family lived there. So they were very happy to rebuild it. So Seti, the famous first Seti, rebuilt the capital there at Avaris. But because the harbor was so silted up, they couldn't get the ships in. They moved downstream a little bit. I mean, so that'd be north. And they reestablished it there at the north. So this is at Cantir. Tel Adaba is just right here. Cantir is right there. So they reestablished, rebuilt it, and they named the city P. Ramses Mary Amun Aa-Nektu, which just means the domain of Ramses, beloved of Amun, great of victories. So this means that's just what it means. And that's his name of the city. So it's actually named Ramses, and they had the capital there. And you can actually see the bulks here and the cities underneath it there. And Bitak's been digging there as well. So there you have Avaris and Cantir. Avaris and also Peru-Nefer is also renamed Peru-Nefer, and then Ramses, all in this area. So the capital was definitely right there during the New Kingdom. So no matter when the Exodus took place, 18th, 19th dynasty, this would have been a capital during the time of the Exodus. Well, over here at Tel Aviv at P-Atum, just take the I out there. Take the A out there. Pithem. That's what it was called. P-Atum. It's a domain of Atum, and it was actually a palace. There was a frontier fortress. It was the second supply city because there was two routes out of Egypt. One going north on the coast, and the other going out into the desert. And so whichever way the army had to go, they had to have supplies, and so they put those supply cities there. Of course, Exodus 1:8-11 says, "Now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. And he said to his people, look, the people of the children of Israel are more and mightier than we. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply. And it happened in the event of war that they also join our enemies and fight against us and so go up out of the land. Therefore they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with their burdens. And they built for Pharaoh supply cities, Pithem and Ramses." So just knowing what you know now about the history, what do we see here? We see a new king who comes to the throne who did not have that family relationship, right? Well, it seems like the second intermediate period, the time when the Asiatic people were ruling, that may be a time when Joseph was there. We can talk about that another time, but that may have been the time when Joseph was there. And well, at whatever rate, that dynasty left and the Egyptians came up. The Egyptians did not know Joseph and his family, and so they saw how big the Israelites were, who also were Asiatic. They're ethnically the same people. They just kicked out of Egypt. There's this huge amount of people there that are ethnically the same people. They said, let's put them into slavery. We know that Amenhotep instituted large-scale slavery, likely this time. And because they were afraid they might join our enemies and fight against us. So if we're over in the Levant area fighting the Hyksos, then all these Hebrews are in the back, Asiatics, they could come right behind us and capture us, and they'd fight behind us. So we have to do something with them. And so they afflicted them, put them in, and made them supply cities. And we have two supply cities. We know the names of the supply cities. We know where they existed. And we know it was shortly after large-scale slavery was instituted. So it seems like the Bible was reflecting actual history, and that we actually are pretty confident of now, which is quite amazing. So it seems like these are the Pithem and Ramses that the Hebrews had to make. So it seems like at the time of the Exodus, at least this is where the land of Goshen. At least by the 18th dynasty, they had to be here. If they were down in the Middle Kingdom someplace, by the 18th dynasty, they at least had to be here so they could build these two supply cities. So Goshen is somewhere in this area. We'll try to pinpoint it a little bit more exact. So to be more exact, let me show you a little bit more about the Wadi Tumulide, that area where Pithem is at. So here again, you can see where the city of Ramses is, either at Tel Adaba or Cantir, depending. We'll answer that question tomorrow, second hour this afternoon. Pithem is here. So this is the Wadi Tumulide. It's actually this area of land that has two narrowing areas. One has this is kind of a large area, then it narrows here at Tel Adaba. It widens out, then it narrows again at Tel Mascuda, and then it widens out again. Back in the ancient times, this is now the pre-dynastic period, what we do is we do core sampling to find out where rivers were. And they were able to determine through core sampling that the Nile at one point flowed down, and instead of going to the Mediterranean, it did go to the Mediterranean, but one branch went through this wadi here, this kind of area, a valley in the rocks, and flowed through it, and flowed all the way, because the water flows downhill, so this is all downhill, actually flowed right down into the Red Sea. And then over time, as the Nile floods and it recedes and the silt gets there to kind of silts up over time, this silted up and created kind of a bitter, brackish water that are the bitter, like we know as the bitter lakes here and also up here as well. Also, this, by the way, this is what the Suez Canal goes through today. But in ancient times, there also was a canal that went through here because the Egyptians kept trying to dig it out and dig a canal so they could have shipping down into the Red Sea. So, but the pre-dynastic period, there was actually the river actually flowed all the way through there. But over time, it dried up so that now if you go there to the eastern zone, this eastern zone looks a lot more like desert area. It probably wouldn't have at some point. If you go into the center area, it's you can see fields and things more for like grazing animals and that kind of thing. Actually, it's perfect for grazing animals. And then the western zone is very much like the rest of Egypt. It's plants. It's tough with the light to see the picture. Anyway, just imagine this is all a bunch of plants here. You can't see it, but anyway, it is, and it's very, very fertile, just like the rest of Egypt. And so, actually, during the second intermediate period, the time of the Hyksos, the time of this great battle, as an archaeologist, her name is Carol Redmont. She did her dissertation on a pottery survey. Pottery is very boring to me. It makes me want to put my head through a wall. But it's part of the thing. It's like this typography, just like cars change. I always have loved Corvettes. I think they're fantastic, but I also like other cars. But you can look at a Corvette and you have a pretty good idea. If you don't know much about cars, you still have a pretty good idea about generally if that's an older, a 70s version or a modern version or something from the 60s. You can kind of tell, right? Just by generally looking. You have to know too much about cars. Over time, things change, and pottery also changed. And we have a lot of theories about why that is. It's most likely dealt with the women. They probably saw something and I like that, and so they adopted it, and slowly things kind of changed. It kind of got driven in that industry. But anyway, check out pottery, and there's pottery evidence of Asiatic. She's also, again, not a Christian in any way, but her dissertation discovered that during the second intermediate period, there was a large group of a family that came into this area. She called them nomadic pastoralists, which is basically shepherds that travel. So these shepherds came in, and she said they were all it looked like this part of the same collective big family, but they had little clans that lived in different areas in this area. And it sounds an awful lot like the Israelites to me. But anyway, that at least it's possible. Again, it's right there. Remember, archaeology isn't trying to prove something. Did it happen? Archaeology is just going to show you, could it have happened? You can always find a reason to argue it didn't happen. But could it have happened? Yes, it could have, right there. There's pottery evidence of that. There's an Asiatic cemetery here. Pithem was becoming this supply city. It's actually a frontier fortress that kind of strengthened it and kind of became the border of Egypt. At some point, Tel Mascuda became Pithem because at some point, they wanted to move this land over. So actually, during the Babylonian period, the late period, and into the Persian period, Pithem was made. It was actually done. Actually, I think it was Edward Neville, I think, who excavated there during the time of Petrie, back in the early 1900s. He excavated Tel Mascuda, and he found bricks made that didn't use straw. And so he said, "Hey, I found Pithem because there's bricks made without straw. That sounds like the Hebrews did it." But if you read Exodus 5, it doesn't say they made bricks without straw. They didn't make bricks without straw. They made bricks with straw, but they had to find their own straw. So Neville didn't read the Bible very well because this was actually too late to even be the Exodus period. But anyway, by the way, that happens a lot. You can watch History Channel. You can watch any of these. There's some really good stuff on there. There's some good stuff. There's also some not so good stuff. But be careful, because any archaeologist, even me, if I do it, tell me, any archaeologist that tells you this has been proven, this is 100% true, you don't believe them because things change. I was actually in Israel I'll tell you this story up to time. I was actually in Israel in 2013 digging at Gezer. Gezer is one of the cities, one of the 3 cities that Solomon built up and fortified. And if you go to Gezer and Megiddo and Hatzor, the same 6-chambered gate is in all. It's the same design, exact same design. From that time period, time of Solomon, all three cities have that. I was working right next to the Solomonic, they call it Solomonic gate, that 6-chambered gate. And we were digging. The first day digging, we got done. Got back to the dig house, ate our lunch, got back, and then the director came out and said, by the way, guys, you know that publication we just published last year saying what we knew happened here at Gezer? Well, it's trash. We just discovered that was all wrong. So the very first day of the next dig, they discovered what they thought was true was wrong based on what they discovered the next year. So that happens. That's why archaeologists dig. So if we knew the answers, we wouldn't be asking money and digging. We know it already. So that's what happens. That's what science is. Science changes. If science doesn't change, then it's not really science. All right. Starting point for the Exodus. So we kind of have an idea where they were when they built these 2 supply cities. We know what they were doing at the time of the Exodus. So was the city starting point the land of Ramses or the city of Ramses? The reason I asked the question is because Exodus 12:37 says, now then the children of Israel journeyed from Ramses to Succoth, about 600,000 men on foot besides children. We won't deal with the issue of numbers today, although if you want to talk about that, you can ask a question. We can do that later. But the city or land of Ramses, which one is this? The starting point for the Exodus. Well, we know where the city is here. There's 2 supply cities. So where is the land at? Actually, if you look at Genesis 47:11, and Joseph situated his father and brothers and gave them possession in the land of Egypt, in the best of the land, in the land of Ramses, as Pharaoh commanded. And then in Exodus 1:11, they're building supply cities, and one of those supply cities is called Ramses. So which one do they leave from? Well, go back to Genesis 47:11. We just read it. Go back a few verses to verses 5 to 6. Then Pharaoh spoke, as Pharaoh commanded, to Joseph, saying, to your father and brothers have come to you. The land of Egypt is before you. Have your father and brothers dwell in the best of the land, Let them dwell in the land of Goshen, in the land of Ramses. So it seems like Ramses is another name for Goshen. In fact, it seems to be the name of the land where they came into Egypt, where they left Egypt. If you look at the Hebrew spelling for Ramses is exactly the same. This is the R sound here. This is the M sound. These the S's over here. So, but it's all exactly the same. The white is all the same. It's only this first vowel pointing that's different. Well, the vowel pointings weren't added until 8th to 10th century A.D. That's A.D. That's long. That's like almost 1,000 years after Jesus. In the city of Tiberias, they add the vowel pointings to reflect how they pronounced it. So even 1,000 years after the time of Jesus, they still realized that the land of Ramses is pronounced differently than the city of Ramses, so that probably they left from the land of Ramses, meaning that the land was only called Ramses when they moved in and when they moved out. Other time, the whole rest of the time, it's called Goshen. Goshen is, by the way, an Asiatic term. So there seems to be something there with the city, the name. So starting point from Exodus probably was the land of Ramses, not the city of Ramses, which means they left from Goshen. And that makes a lot more sense, doesn't it, that they would leave from the land they were living in? Why would you make everybody move from the land to go up to the city and then come back down again and leave? That doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So leaving from the land makes a whole lot more sense, and now we kind of know. So the land of Goshen was probably someplace in this area so that they could build both of these cities, and it's also called Ramses. It had the name Ramses. Back one. By the way, near and up from Avaris. So here's Avaris here. It's near and it's upriver, and it's also near Pithem and Ramses. So that's why Goshen is somewhere in that area. And if ever I could get a chance, I almost had a chance to go digging there. I was going to I did my MA thesis in University College London in England, and my PhD was going to be dealing with an excavation that took place in this area, but everything kind of fell through and it wasn't a chance to actually do that. But maybe someday in the future we'll get a chance to do that. Goshen is the Wadi Tumulide. Where in the Wadi Tumulide? Well, it seems like they probably were living in the central zone when they came in during the second intermediate period. It's the best of the land for grazing animals. So probably is where they lived. And then when they were put into slavery, they started building a supply city, a frontier fortress. They were moved over to this part of it, and it's where they ended up living until the time of the Exodus, which could have been either at Tel Adaba or Tel Kantir. All right, so the question is, why didn't they leave? If they were there, and we know they were there during the Second Intermediate Period, during the Hyksos War, during that Hippopotamus War, why didn't they leave with the Hyksos? Why would they stay? If they were friends with that ruling family, why not just go out at that time? I don't have an answer for you, except that maybe it's a mistake. Maybe they were too comfortable. They had no taxes. They had perfect land for the grazing. Sure, administration changes, but what difference does administration make when that changes? I ask, as we have inflation. But God fixes our mistakes. God has a way of fixing mistakes in life. Whatever mistakes you make in life, whatever mistakes we choose to do, sometimes we find out later on it is actually a mistake, and God fixes that. Well, where did Israel live in Egypt? Probably somewhere in the Wadi Tumulide, probably in the western zone in the time of the Exodus period. So that means somewhere probably here. So could they have seen the pyramids? Well, it's unlikely they could have seen the pyramids, because even from here, the pyramids are quite a ways away, unless during the time when they were shepherds, they took some picnics and vacations and holidays down to the pyramids, they probably wouldn't have seen them. Even when they were slaves, they probably had no time whatsoever to leave and go. So as close as they are, it's not likely they would have seen them, although it's not impossible. Of course, it's possible they could have seen them. And if they were in much earlier during the Middle Kingdom, maybe it's even easier. All right, so that's the end of that presentation. The question, did Pharaoh die in the Red Sea, we'll answer in the next presentation. But why don't we open it up now to questions? Yes, we have a microphone. Oh, okay. Yes, okay, so I want to ask a question about the numbers. So a few things to keep in mind when we talk about numbers. In Exodus 1, it mentions that there were 70 persons that came to Egypt, right? But if you look at what that means and you compare it to Genesis, it's at 46, where it mentions exactly who came into Egypt, you realize that it didn't count all the family members. Some of the boys had wives, and those wives weren't counted. So that number 70 is not the 70, probably something like 88 people came in. Joseph and his sons aren't part of the 70 that came in. So that you start calculating who was involved in that. I'm actually working on an article about this at the moment. But it actually, you count who was coming into Egypt. It wasn't 70 persons. It was 70 people that came from the body of Jacob. Jacob himself, and I think he counts Leah, his wife. Rachel was already dead. Doesn't count the other two wives, but does count the Leah. And it counts all the sons and grandsons and Dinah, the daughter. And it counts maybe one other daughter. It doesn't count anybody else. So all the wives, anybody else wasn't counted. And then we go to Genesis, well, by the way, Exodus 12, it says 600,000 men. That number is also not correct, because in Numbers 1, it's actually 603,550. So that's 600,000 is actually a rounded number as well. But it's actually it's a bigger number. It doesn't make it an easier problem, it makes it a little harder problem. But if you realize that it was 4 generations in Egypt, but when they moved to Egypt, they didn't suddenly become sterile and have no more kids. In fact, when Jacob is blessing Joseph's sons, he says, these two, Ephraim and Manasseh, he crosses his hands, you remember the story, these two are going to be my sons, right? Because of the birthright blessing. He says, any sons you have after that are going to belong to these tribes. So even Jacob was assuming there's going to be more kids being born. So just because the names are mentioned there doesn't mean there weren't more. There had to be more. In fact, most families in Egypt had seven children. That was typically average at the time. But infant mortality was really, really high. But Exodus chapter 1 mentions 3 different unique periods of time where God purposely multiplied beyond an amazing abundance of multiplication, meaning probably no infant mortality. So those kids survived. If Jacob had 12 sons, why couldn't each of those sons have had at least 7? And if you do the math from that coming all the way down, by the time you get to 4 generations in Egypt, that's 6 generations altogether, you already have 700 and something thousand just guys. And of course, they only needed 600 and something thousand. So it jumps really, really fast. If you do, I think it's 9. If you do 9, it jumps really, really fast to get up to 700,000. So 7 probably is a number. 9 is probably the number they had for not having infant mortality. And also remember, they didn't just marry Hebrew women. In fact, most of the wives of Jacob's sons were Canaanite people, the people in the land. Or other Asiatic people in the area. So we know that some Egyptians married Hebrews, because we have an example in Leviticus of that happening. So I personally, I'm not going to try to convince you. You don't have to. I believe the numbers in the Bible. I believe the numbers in the Bible. I don't believe that they're large military units, as sometimes is being said, because if you look at Numbers 1, and it mentions it, the ancient author, who I think was Moses, the ancient author tallies it, and in order to do that, although I did learn math from Mr. Carlson, to do that, you have to carry the 1. Okay, and if you carry the 1 and you add it up, the sum given in the text of Numbers 1 is the actual right sum. So the ancient author meant for those to be actual numbers. So I believe the Bible tells the right numbers. When we talk about ancient people and population, usually you're listening to atheists and evolutionists talking about it. And they don't believe that there were large numbers at the time because they had to be smaller populations getting to larger ones. They don't believe in these large groups of people. But you also remember, archaeological record has usually people were living in tents, and tents have no archaeological footprint. So in an ancient city, you have an ancient city that maybe holds 3,000 or 4,000 people, but then you have the boundaries to the city that are quite a bit further out, and people lived in tents all the way around that city. That the whole city wasn't just in the walls. The city was this whole entire population, but there's not going to be any footprint archaeologically anywhere out there to know how many people were there. So the size of the city's boundaries gives you an idea that there was much, much more people than we think. And there are a lot of indications in the ancient records of a lot more people as well. So I think the numbers are correct, and I think it happened just as the Bible said it did. Thank you for answering that. Yes, over here.
Thank you. So when the Israelites came in, they went into Goshen, the best part of the country. Yes. I mean, they were in a famine, though.
Yeah.
Yet Goshen still had a place for them to feed their cattle, whatever they brought with them.
Right.
Flocks, okay.
Yeah, that's
so
good.
Why that one area, but everybody else is experiencing?
Yeah, that's good. A very good question. Yeah, so famines happen in different ways. In Egypt, the famine could happen if the flood was too high and it would wash all the silt away, so there wouldn't be fertilizer in the fields. Or if the flood didn't get high enough and the silt didn't get to the field, so again didn't fertilize the field, you could have famine in Egypt. But it seems like the famine from the Joseph story was a famine that came from a wind. From the desert winds that dried everything out and brought everything in. And this affected not just Egypt, but it also affected the surrounding areas. So that had to be something much more than just the Nile itself. It had to be something bigger. So the Nile itself was still operating. In fact, it's probably quite possible the Nile itself, everybody was coming to Egypt during the famine, which means the Nile itself probably was fertilizing enough fields that probably was enough food in Egypt. Egypt itself properly was all the land watered by the Nile. Once you get to the area where this desert, the ancient Egyptians didn't consider that Egypt anymore. That's a desert land. So when it says they brought them to the land of Egypt, that means it has to be in a land that was watered by the Nile, enough at least to have a vegetation growing up. So it's not a famine like we think of Ethiopia during Ethiopian famines. It's probably a famine where there's not enough grain and food from crops being destroyed and people coming to Egypt trying to find food and things in there. So that's probably why.
So he stayed for the 7 years,
right.
And he had enough food for everybody.
Right.
Of course, everybody had to sell all they had, so they became enslaved to Egypt.
Yes, and by the way, that's something also very interesting. Yes, so we're not getting to this time, so I'll tell you it's another presentation. But yes, so at this time, the time we showed you about Cayenne attacking and kind of getting control of Egypt during a time of a famine, that time. So before that time, the Middle Kingdom, I told you this last night, the Middle Kingdom, the king was a ruler, but actually the power belonged to the governors, the nomarchs, right? But then suddenly, for some reason, and nobody knows why, in the New Kingdom, all the land is owned by the king. Only that owned by the priests property wasn't owned by the king. Everything else was owned by the king. And it's amazing, but the Joseph story actually tells us how that could have happened. And so, yeah, they did sell everything and brought everything in, but maybe they had enough for the flocks. I don't know. Sheep don't eat anything. I'm actually over in Jordan. Pastor's been with me in Jordan, and you know how dry those hills are? And they still find something to eat there. I don't know what they're eating. It's amazing. They literally eat anything. It's very good questions. Well, next hour we're going to be talking about who the Pharaoh of the Exodus was, and so maybe save that question, and if we don't get to it, I can come back to it. Yes, in the back. My wife's going to ask a question, so I don't know.
Why is it important to know where they lived?
Okay, very good question. If you invite me back sometime, I'll answer that question. I have a presentation on the plagues of Egypt. I have a presentation on the route of the Exodus, and also on the golden calf story and what archaeology means. I also have a whole presentation on the sanctuary, because my dissertation actually was on the archaeology of the sanctuary. That's a whole other huge thing. Actually, when I'm going back tomorrow, I'm doing a presentation about part of that for this conference in Andrews. To know where they lived matters, because not only does it matter for the route going out of Egypt, but it also matters to help you understand what the situation was at that time. And the plagues part of it, I'll give you a little preview. When you're reading about the plagues, you have to ask yourself a question, and I'm not going to answer the question for you. You have to answer it for yourself. Does God punish somebody without warning them? And so in the story of the plagues, there's a couple different times where God says, do this because tomorrow I'm going to do this. So is God going to punish people who can't find, they don't have cell phones, there's no radios. Is God going to punish somebody who can't be warned? In other words, were the plagues all through all the land of Egypt, to both the two lands of Egypt, or just the one land of Egypt, or was it regional? That's a question you have to ask yourselves. Does God punish people without them even getting a chance to get their animals in for the hail? That kind of thing. So.
Is on?
Yes, there you go.
As you know, that there is some controversy over where the crossing of the Red Sea it was or is. Do you have any comments about that?
I have a whole presentation on that. And I would love to come back sometime and show you to you. But yeah, there were 5. The short of it all is, without giving you the answer, there's actually 5 theories about that. All the theories have a difficulty. I personally believe the traditional route is the right route, but what is the traditional route? People debate about what the traditional route is, and so I'll save that for another time. But I do have a theory about that, and we can talk some more about that another time maybe. Yeah, it's a good question. It's one of the debated questions. There's 7 major debated topics. Numbers is one of them. The route of the Exodus is one of them. Who the Pharaoh is, the geography, the date, how long the sojourn was, all those, the plagues, all those are the main debated parts about the Exodus. My point, by the way, for doing all of this, for researching all this, besides I find it fascinating, is during my studies in Egyptian archaeology, I realized there is so much more about this story that we don't even talk about, because we just keep spinning our wheels on these same 7 topics. And so what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to put together material, I haven't finished it yet, that actually covers all the positions responsibly, fairly, and says this is why everybody believes what they believe. Now let's leave those alone and go through the other things, because there's so much we're missing about these kind of things. And so that's kind of sort of why my motivation for doing all this is. By the way, if you don't want to wait, you can ask me after, and I'll tell you afterwards. Anybody else? Is there any questions from online maybe, or?
There was one, but it's related to yesterday.
Oh, that's fine. That's fine. We do it. You can do it again. The microphone's coming here to you.
That was a question related from yesterday. The question says, I'm just going to read it quoitely. I assume the pyramids had a spiritual connotation to the Egyptian people. Maybe Dr. Baker touched on that last night, or maybe today. I'm wondering what that may be. And if the pyramid shape will be used by God, how has Satan used it? For everything God has in place, we know that Satan has a counterfeit.
Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah, we did talk about a little bit in the questions and answers last night. I shared a theory I have about the New Jerusalem. You don't have to accept that at all. But the New Jerusalem and also the Garden of Eden. The Egyptians believed that the pyramids were the mound of creation. They actually believed that they're temples also. Creation was very important to them. And so they believed that this mound of creation is an important place for their kings to be buried in. The pyramid shape itself has become mysticized by modern science and other things. I don't know that I believe in a lot of that. But even how the pyramids were placed and where they were placed, that there's some good evidence that the Great Pyramids, the 3 that at Giza, are laid out in a very similar way to the stars in Orion's belt. You can probably seen things on that. There's a lot more to be learned about the Egyptians and what they were doing with these things. The pyramids are incredible. I think it is from one side to the other side, the foundation of Khufu's pyramid, the Great Pyramid. I think it's only not level by 1 degree. It's like something ridiculous. It's something ridiculous for that time period. And I showed you last night how nice they were made. So there is a lot of mysticism in it. But archaeologists haven't really come too much into what that answer might be. There's not a whole lot of evidence, textual evidence about what the pyramids were, why they were that way they were, except that they were associated with creation in some way. So it's a good question. I don't know if they have a really good answer beyond that. Like why was there a passageway? Why was there this granite burial chamber in the middle of this limestone pyramid? Why all that? I don't think anybody has any answer for. So I won't speculate beyond that. I know you can go on YouTube and find a bunch of theories. I wouldn't recommend it though, but you can do that. Yeah. Anything else? Okay, why don't we take a 5 or 7 minute stretch, get your legs up. I know people had a good lunch, and so there's some dozing off. I don't take offense by that at all. I would do the same thing if I was you. So go drink some water. What's that? Should we get going on the next one? Something in my eye. All right, welcome back to the Archaeology of the Exodus. I am L.S. Baker Jr., as you know, and this time we're going to read a quote from Arthur Weigel, who's an archaeologist. He said, "It would be hopeless to attempt to put into writing those impressions which go to make the entering of a great sepulcher so thrilling. One cannot describe the silence." Those who have been to Egypt, you guys, you know, the echoing steps, the dark shadows, the hot, breathless air, nor tell the sense of vast time and the penetrating of it which stirs one so deeply. That's amazing. That's exactly how I feel when I go inside. Same. It's just incredible. When you walk into one of these tombs, you walk into a pyramid, it's incredible. It's incredible. If you want to stay in contact with me, this is my contact information. You can email me at Andrews. It's LS Baker Jr. at Andrews. My Instagram, I'm not on Twitter anymore, so cross that one off. But Instagram, Ellis Baker Jr., and Facebook, Ellis Baker Jr. Instagram, I put pictures up of just the different things I do, mostly archaeology stuff, different places I go. I tell you a little bit about Egypt, some of the places, and explain some things. I'm also on Facebook as Ellis Baker Jr. You also can find me, my personal account is Scotty Baker. So if you can find Pastor, you probably can find me if you want to get to the more personal side of that. But Ellis Baker Jr. is my professional accounts. I'd love to hear from you. If you have more questions, I can't promise I know the answers, but that's kind of the fun of it, isn't it? If you know, I won't make anything up, I promise that. I'll just tell you what I think, and I'll tell you if it's a speculation or if it's real, and that's where I'll leave it. Who was the Pharaoh of the Exodus? The Golden Horse. Well, you know when everybody agrees when they left Egypt, so whoever the Pharaoh of the Exodus was, he lived during this time period, someplace, the New Kingdom. We also know, based on these three theories, they all agree, it's either the 18th or the 19th dynasty, so we'll be looking at those theories. The two that say literal in Egypt put up in the 18th dynasty. There's 430 years all in Egypt who did that. For when they came into Egypt, that matters, but not for when they leave Egypt. Again, full disclosure, I believe in the middle one, the 430 years all in Egypt and Canaan, because of Paul in Galatians. I don't like to argue with Paul. And I do appreciate that there is a way to understand that in Genesis and in Acts based on the affliction part of it. It's also, by the way, the SDA Bible Commentary's position. I think Siegfried Horn had the same position, and I agree with that. But I have colleagues that believe this, and I have colleagues that believe this, and they're all responsible. And so I will let them believe what they want, and we'll have good discussions. And maybe someday more evidence will come, and I'll shift. But at least for now, that's where I'm at. At the time of the Exodus, we just did this one a few minutes ago. The city of Pithem was definitely at Tel Arataba. The city of Ramses was either here or here. It was named Ramses during the 19th dynasty, but whether that name in the text is an earlier name or it's a later name that was put in later in the text, we don't know. At the time of the Exodus or later, we don't know. So that time period right there, and that the land of Goshen or Ramses was in this area someplace here. Originally it was over here, but then it got moved over during the time of oppression. The pyramids are down there. So that's what we've just been through. We also, where they left in Egypt, when they came into Egypt, where did they live? They could have lived in any of these three areas. Nobody puts them down here. It's either one of these two spots, here in the Middle Kingdom, or a second intermediate period. Those are the two places where they're put. Okay, so to start off with this talk, we're going to start with the Valley of the Kings. The Valley of the Kings is down in that southern city, the city that nobody thinks the Israelites were at, down here in the south at Thebes, right across the river on the west side. You can see the Valley of the Kings is mentioned right here on this map. And it's actually, here's the Nile River, and the Valley of the Kings is right over there. The Valley of the Kings looks like this. If you were to go to it today, those who have had a chance to be there, it's spectacular. One of my favorite things, by the way, of being an Egyptian archaeologist is when you go in, they give us a little card that's laminated. It has my name on it and everything, and it says basically I can go anywhere I want to. So if you're a visitor going to the Valley of the Kings, you get to choose 3 tombs to go in. They usually have 7 to 9 open, and I can go in with my car. I go to all 9. I go to all of them. And tourists going to go to 3. I feel bad for the tourists. I was a tourist at one point. I know how that is. But it's so much fun to go into anything you want to go into. It's really, really great. But so basically what the Valley of the Kings is, it's a big valley coming through here. You see it down here. The gray part is the road, the modern kind of gravel road you walk up. And then the tombs are off of each of these And they're all over. Kent Weeks has been working on the Theban mapping project, where they've been using high-resolution, I guess, laser imaging and GPS and all that to actually map out accurately in 3 dimensions all the tombs. And so they've been able to accurately put on a map now this way. They actually have a 3-dimensional one. I don't have that. But one of my favorite tombs is KV5. The first 10, by the way, were known from antiquity. The first 5 were robbed out very early on. I'm sorry, the first 10 were robbed out very early on. But then later on, they started finding more tombs after that. And so then now they're up to, I think, 63 or 64. I think 64 is where they're at now. 62, by the way, is Tutankhamun. So basically what this tomb was, it's the largest tomb, but the time that Kent Weeks was doing his mapping project, he didn't want to do this tomb because this tomb was small. It was just this little bit right here. They knew a little bit of it, but it wasn't very much to it, because what happens is this valley doesn't rain very much in Egypt, but when it does rain, the rain rushes down into this wadi through these ravines here, comes down in, and all this flood debris gets washed into the tombs, and it becomes like concrete. And so this tomb had been known forever. It's a little couple rooms in it, and it has all this flood debris in it, and there's ancient graffiti of people writing things up there from times past. But he's like, okay, so for the project, you have to be accurate. You have to do everything. So I have to go in and clean it out. So put money into that and clean it all out. When they cleaned it all out, they came into this big room here, which has, 16 pillars in it. And they can see just the tops of the pillars, because the concrete is they're all the way down. And so they said, well, let's just dig out around the walls and see what we discover. And so they found some doorways. They found one in the back with some stairs going down. And so they said, oh, that's interesting. So let's go down those stairs. So they went down those stairs, opened the door, and here was a hallway going all the way down with doors all the way down on both sides and no flood debris. It's been robbed out. There was nothing in it. But they went down each of these rooms, and this little single rooms all the way down till they got to the very last 2 doors, and they weren't rooms. They were other hallways with more doors on both sides, going both ways. It's incredible. Just the discovery of it is so much fun. Then they found other doorways here going down with more, and it became this large tomb. In fact, now you can see it mapped out. Here's the original couple rooms here, this big pillared hall, and then that original long one here, and all these rooms that come off of it, other chambers off of it. These are going back down underneath the road, the modern road, and they discovered more tombs. And they covered another hallway going this way. They still haven't finished it. There's another hallway going back this direction. They haven't finished it. There's tons more to be discovered in this, and they're still discovering, even today, more and more rooms. This was a tomb that Ramses the Great had for his sons. He wanted all of his sons to have tombs. He outlived 12 of them, and so he had to have a place to bury them. So he just started making chambers for them to be buried in while he was still king. The 13th one, Merenptah, became the king after him. But eventually he wanted all of his sons in here. Whether they all made it there or not, we don't really know. But it's a massive, incredible tomb. And here's this tomb that has been there all this time, and nobody knew because they thought this tiny little thing there. That's when archaeology becomes super, super fun, because you're like, oh, nobody knows this at all. Well, this is a little bit dangerous right now, this part over here, this one here, because this goes under the road. And in times past, they would bring the tourist bus right up into the valley, and these big buses were going over the road, going over that tomb and busting up the rocks underneath it. And so they've now been able to stabilize it, but it's taking a lot of time. The buses, by the way, don't go up that far anymore. The tomb you guys are all probably familiar with is Tutankhamun's tomb. So KV5 is right here. You kind of get an idea of it. KV62, one of the last royal tomb, was found right here. And the reason why it was preserved was because a tomb above it that was being dug, actually all the debris from the digging covered it up. And so that it wasn't found in antiquity by thieves, but it lasted to recently modern times in the early 1900s. So what he did is Carter came down this slope, and he put his kind of candle famously through this little hole in the doorway. And this is a reconstruction of what he would have seen. All this gold and all these storage stuff. So you can imagine it. This room, the first room, is all filled with things. There's an antechamber also filled. It seems like ancient thieves did get in and stole some things. And this back room here got kind of tossed a bit. The ancient priests sealed it all back up again. And then in the making of the new tomb, it got covered, so they got kind of preserved that way. If you get a chance to see pictures, over in this wall right here, there's actually 2 statues facing each other. Both of them are of Tutankhamun. And this was actually closed off. You see over here, it kind of closed off. There's a little hole in the bottom down here. Now it's completely gone, by the way. But when Carter started digging, there's a little hole in the bottom. Well, actually, Carter is the one who dug that hole. So if you see some ancient pictures of that, photography of that wall before it was taken out, there's a little basket kind of propped up against the wall because Carter and Carnarvon, his patron, actually dug a hole and went in because they wanted to make sure that it was all there before the Antiquities Department came, and so they actually got a chance to see everything ahead of time. Then they covered it up with a basket, so in the pictures, it looks like nobody had been in there yet. Yeah, that's, anyway, sneaky guys. But anyway, the things that were in there were amazing. Oops, I think I blocked it. So in the burial chamber itself, I see here's these two statues here where they, on the other side of that doorway, is actually the mummy of Tutankhamun. The famous death mask is over him. Then there's another sarcophagus over that, coffin, these big sarcophagi above them, layers and layers and layers and layers until you get this canopy. This whole thing is just layers and layers and layers. It's quite amazing. All this is now in the Cairo Museum. If you get a chance to go there, you'll see all of that. Well, just recently, this is in the news because Nicholas Reeves, who, by the way, translated, I think, that quote I gave you at the beginning, that's where I got that quote from. He actually is an expert in the Valley of the Kings. He looked at these the high-resolution images. And one thing you can do with digital, by the way, if anybody's interested in archaeology and you don't think you don't really want to get dirty or whatever, but you're interested in technology, there's so much technology goes into archaeology now. So what they thought was, well, we can do something. We can look at these walls and we can now take the paint off the walls and just see the walls themselves. So we're using computers. And he thought he saw evidence that maybe there was more chambers. So what he saw, so here's the burial chamber itself, the north wall, west wall, the south wall, which you come through, and then the east wall, which goes to another chamber. So you kind of can see all that there. And he thought you take the paint off, just kind of digitally take it off, and he thought he saw something here and something here. He thought he saw doorways. So right about here there's a doorway, and right about here there's a doorway. But it's behind the paint, so you don't want to destroy the ancient paint. In fact, the reason why they're doing this, map using that high resolution imaging, is they want, you see all this this kind of black kind of specks here? That's mold. Because it's so hot in Egypt. You know how hot it is. It's so hot in Egypt, but tourists go there so many every day, and they sweat, and the humidity in this tomb is going to be so high that the mold is actually destroying the ancient artwork. And so they want to make a replica of Tutankhamun's tomb, a replica down to the minutest detail, and make that down by Howard Carter's house near the entrance so people can go and experience the tomb without actually going into the tomb anymore, because trying to find a way to preserve it. And so that's just one of the things they're doing. But in the process, they thought maybe so they brought GPS, that's a ground penetrating radar, try to see if there's anything there. I'll go back, let me go back actually to here, ground penetrating radar, and there was one test that said, yes, there's a hallway there. The second test said, no, there isn't one. They took a third one from on top, and it said, yes, there is a void there. So now the question is there or isn't there, and nobody knows. What they need to do, and what everybody agrees they need to do, is they need to go to this antechamber room here. There's no decoration on this wall. So if there is actually a hallway going this way, they could just drill a little, maybe even just a little fiber optic cable and go through and see if there actually is something there. Because if there's something there, that has not been touched by anybody since the time Tutankhamun's tomb was put there. The whole idea is that royal tombs in the valley, they come down, they turn, in the 18th dynasty, this is the 18th dynasty, they turn to the left. They angle to the left. This one, Tutankhamun's, angles to the right. The only tombs that do that are the queen's tombs. So is it possible that this is Nefertiti's tomb, and that Tutankhamun died so young that they didn't have time to make a tomb for him, so they just walled up that and made this a tomb? That's the theory. Now, whether it's true or not, I don't know, but it is a lot of fun to think about. So maybe one of these days we'll find all this stuff from that time period, and who knows what's in there? Who knows things we can learn from that? That brings us back to the idea about this whole idea about the tombs not being safe, being robbed out. Most of them were robbed out in antiquity. In fact, most of them are in caches. One of the royal caches is right here. This is the Valley of the Kings is right back here. This is Hatshepsut's mortuary temple here, and I guess with the cliff area here, right over here, right up in there, is actually this hole in the ground. It's a Deir el-Bahari Cache 320. The story about this one is that these Abu Razul brothers actually were selling antiquities on the antiquities market, and they obviously were royal. And they go, "Where did you guys find this stuff?" So they actually tortured them, and made. I know it's awful, but at the time, as an archaeologist, I'm really glad they did it because because what they found was go down this pit here, and go down here, and all of these kings. These royal mummies, one after the other, the priests had taken them all out and put them here to save them from the ancient robbers. And so actually, the other place where that will cache, I'll show you who was there in a minute, but the other cache was actually a KV-35. KV-35 is right here. So here's Tutankhamun there. Here's KV-5 there. KV-35 is over here. This is Amenhotep, the second Amenhotep. Remember, he was the pharaoh who the northern capital was abandoned for some reason. We don't know why. So this is his tomb. In his tomb, all around him, were also more mummies. For some reason, they made one of these royal caches in his tomb, which is in the valley. But nobody knows why that was. In his tomb was also a prince. And you know it's a prince because he has a side lock. He's been hacked by an ancient robber, but he was actually buried there. Also in KV-35 is second Amenhotep, of course. His son, the third Amenhotep, Hatshepsut is in there. A couple of Ramses are in there. Second Seti is in there. The fourth Thutmose is in there, and a couple anonymous people. So this is one of the side rooms, and have all these royal mummies were in there in the cache. In Deir el-Bahari, I don't expect you to read this, but just kind of see it. Deir el-Bahari cache, you can kind of see. So this is KV-35 here. So you see all of these dots on this side, all the ones that the Abu Rasul brothers were robbing out. So there's actually quite a lot of royals there, including some of the famous ones like Ramses and the third Thutmose and the first Amenhotep, second. They're all there, and so they're in that royal cache, and they all ended up outside of their place. The only kings that are actually in their tomb were Tutankhamun and the second Amenhotep for some reason. So let's start with the names of the kings. The kings list. Who's the pharaoh of the Exodus? Well, it matters if you know one of these people on this screen was the pharaoh of the Exodus because it happened in the New Kingdom. Probably happened during the 18th or 19th dynasties of the New Kingdom. One of these. You notice these names are very, very similar. There's 4 Amenhoteps. The fourth one is Akhenaten, the heretic pharaoh, so-called heretic pharaoh. The first Amenhotep is the one who had the slavery, mass slavery, instituted mass slavery in Egypt. Second Amenhotep is the one who the northern capital was abandoned. The fourth Amenhotep was Akhenaten. The heretic king became the father. He's the father of Tutankhamun. Just kind of give you some ideas. There's also 4 Thutmoses. First Thutmose, second, third, fourth. There's also 2 Setis. There's also, oops, I did it again. I think I'm hitting on something wrong. There's also 11 Ramses. These are not at all related to these, but they liked the name, I guess. They just went back with it and didn't have no creativity whatsoever at that point. And everybody was Ramses. All right. So actually, a king actually had 5 names. The name we're familiar with is their birth name, their nomen, which is a last name. That's the name they're born here. This is from the first Senusret. He's actually a king of the Middle Kingdom, a 12th dynasty. So you have his Horus name. That's the same type of name that the Narmer palette had for Narmer, that Horus name. Then the Nepti name, the 2 ladies, Wajet here and Nekbet. Remember I showed you that, the 2 lands, the 2 ladies, the 2 lands. The Golden Horus, this whole presentation is called the Golden Horus because if you were the king, you were Horus. And the skin of the gods is gold. And so they considered you to be a god. If you became pharaoh, you became a god. And so your Golden Horus, your god name was this one here. The prenomen is your throne name. That's the sedge plant and the bee. I showed you that a little bit earlier too. The Nesert Bidi. That's your throne name. That's a unique name. There's very little similarities in those names. That's how we can tell these people apart. And then there's the nomen, which is the birth name, and that repeats. That's like the Ramses 11 times or whatever. And so the yellow is all the throne names. I won't bore you with that, but I do want you to see that there's some repetitiveness in these throne names, but it's the uniqueness in the details that helps you identify who's who. So for example, Keper, it means great. Keper is the of being, and then of Ra, you know Ra, the sun god. So Keper Ka, Re, Ka means the life force of Ra. So the great is the being of the life force of Ra. That's what his name means. It doesn't matter what it means. But Keper Ra, Keper Ra, Keper Ra. The only thing that changes is this name element. Keper Kare, Keper Enre, and Ure. This is the plural. U is the plural. So that, but just by knowing that, you can then know who the actual king is. You couldn't, if you saw Tutmos, you wouldn't know which Tutmos it was. But if you saw this name, you know, oh, that's the second Tutmos. That's how I know that's the name. So that's really important to kind of have that memorized. As you don't need to memorize it, but I memorize it, kind of get used to it. Or you refer back to books as well. Same thing with Men-Keper-Ure. That U is the only thing that makes that different, but it's two different people. And it's very, very important. Okay, the third Tutmos, by the way, was the very first Pharaoh. In the Bible, you're going to read about pharaohs going way back. But what that means is that the book of Genesis was written after the third Tutmos became king, which is fine because I don't think anybody puts it before that. But the reason why he's the first pharaoh is the term pharaoh just means the great house, the big house. It refers to the royal family. And so up to that point, the whole royal family was called pharaoh. But then Hatshepsut became king. Hatshepsut was a woman who became king, stole the throne away from her nephew. Actually, it's a stepson, really. Hatshepsut and her brother Tutmos were actually married to each other. This is one of those things. He died early, had a son, and then she took the throne. This is the example I was telling you earlier. Tutmos was too young to rule, so Hatshepsut ruled instead for about 20 years or so. We'll get to her story a little bit later. But anyway, Tutmos, when he became king, he's like, enough of this royal family being called Pharaoh. I am Pharaoh, only me. And so he became the Pharaoh, and after that, everybody became Pharaoh, was just the king himself. So he's the first, by the way, he's one of the candidates for Pharaoh of the Exodus, so that's an important thing. His name means born of Thoth, because Moses is a name element. You see that? Tutmosis, Moses. It just means born of whatever the god's name is. In this case, the god Thoth, who's the god of wisdom, the god of the moon, the god of medicine, the scribe god. In fact, in the new kingdom alone, Moses, name element, Ka Moses, Ah Moses, Tut Moses, Amen Moses, Waj Moses, Mer Moses, Ptah Moses, Ra Moses, Happy Moses. These are all men Moses. These are all God's names here. So it's very clear that the name Moses in the Bible is a name element. It simply means born of. In fact, the name Ra Moses and Ramesses is the exact same name in ancient Egyptian. The only difference is modern Egyptologists have changed the vowel to an O for 18th dynasty and an E for 19th dynasty, just to keep them separate. But it's the exact same name. It means the exact same thing. So Ramesses or Ramosis, it's all the same name. But Moses is a name element. In Exodus 2:10, it says, and the child grew, and she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. So she called his name Moses, saying, because I drew him out of the water. Well, Moses doesn't mean drawn out of the water. Moses means born of. So what is this talking about? In fact, the word Moses itself is used in Psalm. It's an old Hebrew that actually just means drawn out. The Hebrew word does. But where they got that from this story, because the name Moses actually means born of. So what this means is that in the story, Jochebed and Amram have their baby boy, 3 months old. She now has to go back to work, because if you are a mother and you give birth to a baby and the baby dies, which happens all the time, then you have 3 months to recover before you got to go back to work. Now, if you're able to breastfeed, the baby survives, you can stay all 3 years at home. And so if you're having multiple children, and remember the Hebrews are multiplying many times, a lot of the women could just stay home. The more children you have, the longer you can just stay home. And so they encourage them to have more families, which also encourages the larger numbers. So why would you go work in the fields if you could have a child and keep so that's what they did. But their child had to die, because remember, the boys had to be killed. They hid him, but for all intents and purposes, everybody thought he was stillborn. Right? So you have 3 months to recover, then you got to go back. So at 3 months, she couldn't hide him anymore, because she has to go back to the field to work. So that's the Egyptian part of it. Now the biblical story is they're like, okay, so what do we do? They're obviously praying the entire time. How do you save your baby? And they came up with the idea of the ark. Going back in time, which is what we do all the time, go back to the Bible stories. What did God do in the past to save somebody? So they created ark. The Hebrew word for ark there in Exodus 1 is the same, Exodus 2 is the exact same word, Hebrew word for the ark of Noah's ark. They obviously are thinking about that story. And then the law says you have to put the boy into the river, but nobody says you can't put him in a boat first. So put them in a boat and put them in the river. So how are we going to do that and not give it away? Well, the women take with them every day these baskets, papyrus woven baskets, pitched inside and out. They put their lunch in it. They put it in the reeds to keep it cool during the day so they can eat their lunch at whenever mid-afternoon or whatever. But instead of putting our lunch in it, we'll put our baby in it, and then we'll go there and put that in the reeds. We'll secure it there. But how long is the baby going to stay in that basket before the baby starts to cry? It's not going to last very long. Everybody who has a baby knows that. You can't keep a baby quiet. I know, I tried. You bring them to church and try. That doesn't work. So what are you going to do? So she puts Miriam a little ways away. The kids, she's too young to work. So she's there with the kids that are too young to work, and she's playing. And it says, watch and see what will be done for him. Not watch over him, but God's going to do something. Either he's going to die, the thing's going to tip over or something, he's going to die, or someone's going to rescue him. Well, the Nile is the longest river in the world. You can literally put that basket anywhere you want to. It will never be found, right? Why put it where the princess is? Hey, why was the princess even there? It says the princess came down to take a bath. Princesses don't bathe in the Nile. They bathe in the pools up in the palace. It's clean water. The only reason the princess would be at the Nile is a god. The Nile is a god happy, the god who brings gifts from the gods to people. Any woman who could not get pregnant would perform ablutions. They take ritual baths. They come down to the water, and they on the riverbank, and they walk down to the water. They lift their skirts up, and as the sun rose in the east, they would dip into the water and ask the gods to give them a son. So that's what she's doing. So imagine these women are there working every day. Jochebed hears Hatshepsut's been coming out. This mother's been coming out. I think it's Hatshepsut. Coming down over and over again, trying to obviously trying to have a son. She's not having a son. And Jochebed is inspired. Put the basket close. Not there, but close. If God wants her to find it, she'll walk by and find it, which we know the story actually happened. And she knew it was a Hebrew baby. You can tell right away. This is not going to be a baby in a basket. Who'd put a baby in a basket? So obviously the basket must be these other baskets with the Hebrews that are working over there. So she knew that right away. And then you know how the story went. So this drawn out, because I drew him out of the water, she's saying he's born of the gods. Now, which God, we don't know, because Moses didn't include that. Moses refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter and refused to call that name. So whatever that name was, something Moses would have been his name. It could have been any one of those names we saw earlier. We don't know. But he refused it, and so he just called himself born of nothing. He thought he failed, by the way. He thought when he killed that Egyptian, he thought it was over for him. He had not succeeded, so he just became Moses. And the name took on meaning because of the story, and then the word Moses itself became a name that meant drawn out, but in Hebrew, but in Egyptian, it didn't mean that at all. So why not, by the way, this would be a lot shorter presentation if the Bible had just named the Pharaoh. So why not name the Pharaoh? Exodus 1:15, then the king of Egypt spoke to the Hebrew midwives, of whom the name of one was Shiphrah, the name of the other was Puah. The Hebrew text actually mentions two midwives of whom we don't know anything out. We'll never hear these women ever again, and their names are there, but the king isn't there. Okay, yeah. Then, if you consider the book of Genesis, which Moses wrote, I believe Moses wrote, it mentions all these other kings, king of Shinar, all these other kings, Sodom and Gomorrah even, kings that got burned up in brimstone, their names are there, but not Pharaoh. In Genesis 12, it just says Pharaoh, which, by the way, means this had to be written after 3rd Tutmos sometime. Okay, the rest of the Bible mentions other kings. By the way, it mentions all these kings. You know all these kings. It even mentions two kings of Egypt, Shishak and Necho, but not from the Pentateuch, not from the Moses. Why? Why would that be? Well, this goes back to what makes a human a human. In ancient Egypt, they believed 5 things made a human a human. One was the body, which is why they spent so much time mummifying bodies. You had to mummify to preserve the body, because to exist in the afterlife, you had to have a body. So that body was preserved. The Ka, this little symbol right here, by the way, that's a hieroglyphic symbol, so now you know a hieroglyphic symbol. Ka, it means spirit or life force. That's all it means. It means life force. So a body, by the way, with a life force is just a zombie. It's just a body moving around, animated with no thought whatsoever, no character, no personality, nothing. Just an animated body, that's all it is. So in order to have a personality, you have to also have a ba. That ba is this little ba bird here with the face of the person who died. That's your personality. The Egyptians believed that. By the way, if you have twins, we used to be in Pathfinders. I was a director for years, and we both were together, and we had twins. And these two boys, they didn't say much, and they look, identical. You can't. We knew how many years did we know those boys? 5, 6, 7 years. If you looked at them across the room, there's not a chance in the world you know if that's Jonathan or David. You have no idea. No idea at all. It's not until they start talking and their personality comes out that you realize, you're David. but it's only a personality. It's only who, so they have the exact same, by the way, body, the exact same life force, because all of us have the same life force. Even animals have the breath of God in it. But a body plus the breath of life creates a person, that character. They believed that that character was detached. The Greeks took that, and that's where we get this whole idea about the soul being separate and different. But this isn't too much different than what we believe if you don't believe it's by itself, if you believe that the character is just an element of you. Because when you die, no matter if you're blown up or whether you die in your sleep at night, your body goes back to ashes. It goes away. Your obviously the life force goes back to God. The Bible's clear about that. What happens to your personality? It's gone. But somehow it exists somewhere in God's mind somehow. I don't know how God does it. We'll find out some other time. Because when God comes back again, Jesus comes in that great morning and he resurrects us. Even those who are still alive are going to be changed from the corruptible to the incorruptible, the mortal to the immortal. And at that moment, we will be whatever character we work on, which is why it's so important that we work on our characters now, because that's the only part we're taking to heaven. Praise God, because this isn't that great. So I can't wait to do something better. Also in Egypt, you needed a shadow. The shadow means you existed in reality under the sun. And then you needed your name. And that's why the names were etched into stone, so they would last forever. The names in stone. In fact, if you were mad at somebody in ancient Egypt, take a piece of pottery, you write their name, and then you smash it. You're really showing them, because they don't exist anymore. But if it's written in stone, it lasts forever. That's why names are all over in Egypt in stone. If you're rich enough to have stone monuments, you could have your name anywhere, it lasts forever. It's important. And so that's why when Hatshepsut became the king, first she was shown as a woman. Later on, she became shown as a male figure. She's still obviously a woman, but she was shown as a male figure because she was king, and is a male figure right here. But later on, her image was chiseled out because they wanted to get rid of her image, and they also wanted to get rid of her name. So here's her name. It's this up here is Amun. Amun. The ripples of water is an N sound, so Amun. And this is foremost of noble women. Her name is Hatshepsut. Beloved of Amun. So that's her name. Well, up here you can see that they left the name of the god Amun there, but they chiseled out Hatshepsut. They crossed out. By the way, her throne name is Ma'at Ka-Re. The Re is gone because of the crack in the stone. But you can see the Ka there, the life force, Ma'at Ka-Re. And the goddess Ma'at is still there. So they didn't get rid of anything that gods they didn't get rid of. They got rid of her name. They chiseled it out because they didn't want her to exist. But because her name was etched in stone, wherever this was taken, it was preserved. So that was kind of the benefit. So why not just name the Pharaoh? Well, it seems like whoever wrote Exodus, which I believe was Moses, was well educated in the customs of ancient Egypt, so that if you didn't have an afterlife, I'm not mentioning your name, and none of the Egyptian kings would have any afterlife. The life that actually mattered, the life that God would give us, the eternal life. But those two midwives, because of what they did, they would live forever. And so he mentioned their names. So it seemed like the author was very familiar with the customs in ancient Egypt. Salvation implications. Okay, so we don't know the king. So who's the king of Egypt? Let's see if we can figure it out. If it was just easy enough to say, this is the date of the Exodus, let's put that date in and pick that king, that'd be easy. But it's not easy because the kings lists are not easy. There actually are a number of kings lists. These are all the dynasties that are listed on all these kings lists. The kings lists that matter to us are, I don't know if I have listed later, are the ones that go through 18th and 19th dynasty. So here, this one, this one, this one. So these four right here are the ones that we care about. This is what they kind of look like. They don't obviously all go together. So it's a new kingdom, 18th, 19th dynasty, 1447 or somewhere in that range, or 1267. We did that last night. So it'd be those four right there. Those are the four we're looking at for the kings lists. Somewhere 18th, 19th dynasty. As a new kingdom. So what was the date of the Exodus? Well, we don't know. It could be any of these dates, but we do know it would be new kingdom, sometime in the new kingdom. In Egypt, there's actually two chronologies. This is where it gets kind of complicated. I'll try to keep it simple. If you observe the first appearance in the sky of Sirius, the star Sirius, and you're in the north, it's slightly earlier in the year than it is if you're in the south. And so there's different time periods of when the year starts. There's also different recordings of when these existed and different ways you measure time. It gets to be quite complicated. But archaeologists have actually worked it down now to a high chronology and a low chronology. And fortunately for the new kingdom, it's only off by about 25 years. So do the high chronology or low chronology matters based on how we're going to plug in these dates for these kings and when they ruled. So we're going to try to plug these in. This theory right here, the third theory about the time, the symbolic one, the reason why they say it's symbolic is because they want Ramses to be the king of the Exodus. So you hear about Ramses the Great, and so this actually theory is all based on just him being the Exodus. If he's not Pharaoh of the Exodus, then this whole line of thinking goes away because there's no other reason why to believe this is symbolic. It probably is literal otherwise. So Ramses, but what about the two literals? What's the Pharaoh there? So using high chronology or low chronology, the date of the Exodus being 1447 or there, very close to it, what would it be? Be either Amenhotep here or Thutmose here. So low chronology or high chronology. So those two kings. In fact, if the Exodus is 1452 to 45, you could even sneak back into Thutmose over here. So the third Thutmose or the second Amenhotep, those are our candidates for the early date of the Exodus. So we have three candidates, third Thutmose or second Amenhotep for either of these two, and then Ramses for the third one. So let's evaluate those and see what we can learn about those three kings. What do we know about them? Well, Thutmose, we know he was the first one to be called Pharaoh. That we know that already. He grew up and lived at the southern capital at Waset, then in Thebes. He's called by modern scholars as the Napoleon of ancient Egypt. The reason is because when he became king, his stepmother, Hatshepsut, ruled for 20 years. When he finally got control back from her, then he went on campaigns over and over. I think it was something like 16 or 17 campaigns into the Levant year after year, 6 months at a time campaigning. And he's just an incredible amount of campaigning. His eldest son didn't succeed him, and he bragged about how strong he had a very big ego, which is kind of common to all these guys. Amenhotep, which is his son, became was another candidate for Pharaoh of the Exodus. He didn't grow up in Waset in the south. He actually grew up in the north. And remember, he's the one who the northern capital was abandoned early in his reign for some reason. He was not the crown prince, but he still became because his elder brother died for some reason. So his elder brother did not become king. He became king. Possibly co-reigned with his dad for 2 years. He also bragged about his strength. And here, also in the Luxor Museum, there's a copper target, and he's shooting arrows through the copper target. I don't know if you can see it, but they're actually sticking out the backside. That's how strong he was. He actually brags that he could, those big boats that they had, he rode one all by himself, he says. So he was quite. And by the way, yeah, we all laugh about that because it is absurd, except that the Bible is full of stories of people who are very strong. So who's to say they weren't strong? I don't know. It's unlikely, though. All right. Then second Ramses, he was born during Horemheb's reign. Remember, Horemheb was the one who went back and started rebuilding the harbor at the northern capital. Didn't succeed too well, so eventually he also co-reigned with his father Seti, who did start building that northern capital. They moved the northern capital north. He was actually his 13th son, Merenptah, became the king after him. He was a great builder of monuments. You've heard a lot about him. Also a great military general. So all three candidates have a reputation for being ruthless. For different ways, different reasons of being ruthless. All three of them were in control of the entire country. All three of them were great warriors. They all ruled, by the way, in the north for a time. They all were great builders. So they all had this all in common. So what's the difference? Well, there weren't too much difference. They actually had campaigned for 6 months, built for 6 months, campaigned at the beginning of his reign, and then when he abandoned the northern capital, he didn't campaign ever again. He abandoned the northern capital, and then he became this benevolent ruler. Everybody was beloved, and he built Egypt to the end of his reign. Ramses campaigned throughout his reign and built throughout his reign. Ramses was a bit of a scoundrel in that he didn't build everything his name is on. Sometimes he would see a building and say, I would like to claim I built that. So he'd have his people chisel out the name and put his name on it. And so he has a lot of things that he built, but he didn't actually build. He did build a lot, though. He built a lot. All right. Supporters of Thutmose and Amenhotep both support the high dating system. Supporters of Ramses support the low dating system. And just to be completely transparent, most secular scholars believe the low dating system is more accurate. So that supports the Ramses a bit more. The third Thutmose is selected because he died close to the Exodus event, and so if Pharaoh died in the Red Sea, his supporters say it has to be Thutmose. And these supporters, by the way, will move the date from 1447 anywhere it needs to be as long as it ends with him dying in the Red Sea. So the Red Sea is key to Thutmose being chosen as Pharaoh of the Exodus because his death was so close to the Exodus date. Amenhotep and Ramses, neither one of them could have died the Red Sea because they both lived long after the Exodus event, no matter when it was there. So we'll come back to that a little bit later. But that's what supporters of the third Thutmose say. See, we already know who it is. It's the third Thutmose because of the Red Sea death. These two couldn't possibly have done that. The third Thutmose chronologically was maybe the chronology of kings of Judah and Israel could be off slightly. Maybe that's why the date doesn't match up so well. The Egyptian chronology is rubber chronology, so maybe it's flexible. The Bible text suggests that Pharaoh died in the Red Sea, and this seems to have happened. Psalm 136:15 says, "But overthrew Pharaoh and his army in the Red Sea. His mercy endures forever." This is his mummy. The mummy is too young to be him, so supporters of Thutmose will say, well, maybe Thutmose died in the Red Sea, and this mummy was substituted for him in death. So that's suggested. They also would say the high chronology is the one that matches up best, which means Amenhotep. The first Amenhotep is where they put him into slavery. They would say that's where Moses was born. They would then say, but then the problem really is that Moses would have been born just before the end of Amenhotep's reign. These blue circles indicate problems. Ellen White says that Moses was adopted by the man who condemned him to die in the Nile. So there's a little bit of a problem because if Moses was born just before the end of Amenhotep's reign, then Thutmose would have been the one who adopted him, and that's not the same. It's not the same. So that is a little bit of a wrinkle there that Ellen White gives us, that maybe a little bit of wrinkle. Also, Thutmose probably died in 1450, somewhere in the area, 1452. There's a little bit of a discrepancy here. The problem is that Thutmose's eldest son died 3 or 4 years before Thutmose died. So he couldn't have died in the 10th plague. So there's a bit of a problem there. Amenhotep was the second son, was not supposed to be king, maybe co-ruled. But if he co-ruled and the Exodus is in 1450, then that means that there was 2 kings on the throne, not 1 king on the throne. But the biblical text doesn't have but 1 king on the throne. So there are some problems with Thutmose. There's a few problems. How about Amenhotep? Well, Amenhotep, the supporters suggest that because the internal chronology fits very, very well, the content of the text also fits very, very well. So they kind of match it up and say, okay, the Red Sea doesn't match up, but everything else seems to match up really, really well. So the horse breeds in Egypt all changed radically at that time period. Well, that could have been because of the 5th plague killed all the horses, and they had to bring new horses in. Could have been Red Sea as well. Could have been Red Sea. Chariots were redesigned in his reign. Well, the chariots were destroyed in the Red Sea. They would have to make new chariots, and maybe that's the time that they upgraded them. Speculation, but possibly. His personality changed. He was very ruthless early on, but when the northern capital was abandoned, he became well-loved. He was benevolent and loved. There's also, this is mummy here. His sores all over his body. We don't know why there's sores on his body. He's the only mummy that has those sores. Some kind of disease, something that he had that maybe this is the leftover scars from the boils. That's the theory. The northern capital was abandoned. Maybe it was abandoned because the plagues destroyed it. Maybe that's why it was abandoned. There's a dream stele that talks about, I think I'll show that picture here in a second, about his son not being the eldest son that ruled. Exodus 2:23 says, "Now it happened in the process of time, the king of Egypt died." Well, in the sermon this morning, we mentioned that Moses killed an Egyptian, and he fled from the face of Pharaoh, and Pharaoh sought to kill him. Well, if this is the case, then that means that Thutmose, the third Thutmose, would be the one who wanted to kill Moses. That might explain why there was so many campaigns into the Levant, because once you go to the Levant and you attack in this Palestine, Canaan area, Syria area, how many times you got to go before there's no armies left to defeat? Why you keep going back? Unless you're trying to find Moses, the only one who could come back and claim the throne over you. So that's an idea. Also says the process of time the king of Egypt died. So whoever was chasing him could not possibly be the Pharaoh of the Exodus. That person was already dead. Also, Exodus 4:19 says, "Now the Lord said to Moses and Midian, go, return to Egypt, for all the men who sought your life are dead." So whoever wanted to kill him, they're gone. So in order for Thutmose to be Pharaoh of the Exodus, then that means that Thutmose never wanted Moses dead. The only one who could take the throne from him, he didn't want him dead. So if Thutmose was. So supporters of Amenhotep will say this seems to be pretty good indication that Thutmose had to have died before the Exodus event. The dream stele. This is the dream stele talks about the 4th Thutmose, who became king after Amenhotep. So after Amenhotep died, his son, the fourth Thutmose, became king because his older brother died. Nobody knows why his older brother died. By the way, this is the prince I showed you earlier from Amenhotep's tomb. This prince could be Prince Amenhotep, or also could be another prince. There's a couple of different princes that died early on. We don't know which, this mummy is not identified, so we don't know who this is, but he was buried there. This dream stele tells a story that one day Thutmose, he was still a prince at the time, was out hunting. And at that time, the Sphinx was buried up to his head. Apparently, this happened a number of times in Egyptian history where this sand came in and buried the Sphinx. This is the time of Napoleon here. They dug him out. When they dug the sand out, they found this dream stele between the paws. Anyway, Thutmose was out hunting, and he wanted to go to sleep. It was hot. You've been to Egypt, you know how it's hot. You'd be anywhere, it's hot. You want to get in the shade. So he got in the shade of the head of the Sphinx. It was still visible. In that shade, he had a dream. In the dream, the god of the Sphinx, Horemheb, came to him and said, if you'll dig me out of the sand, I will make you the king. And so that's what this whole dream stele says. So supporters of Amenhotep will say, well, it's possible that this is a propaganda way to explain how he became king without saying that the 10th plague existed. That's kind of the theory of it. There are a couple of things to point out here. So if Amenhotep put everybody into slavery, it's the first Amenhotep. If the first Thutmose was the one who wanted the babies killed, then this would have been the time shortly after Moses would have been born here. Then that means that he was adopted then at the very end, 1516, 1515. So it had to be almost on the deathbed of the first Thutmose, but it does work. It's a little slippery there. The third Thutmose dies a few years before the Exodus event happens in 1447. So 3 years before, Amenhotep becomes a king, co-regent at that time. There's no problem. Only one king's on the throne at the time of the Exodus. So it seems to work out fairly well, except for the Red Sea problem, because 1447 is the Exodus, and Amenhotep ruled to 1422. So there's a bit of a problem with the Red Sea. Ramses, supporters will select Ramses because the city is named Ramses, because the land is named Ramses. The name appears in the text, therefore it must be. We know the capital city in the north was called Ramses. So it seems like this is a way to honor Ramses, and a biblical text tells us who the Pharaoh is without telling us. That's the theory. Early archaeological reports from Edom and Moab suggest that the Exodus event took place shortly after Ramses' death. There's destruction, layers in the conquest. Cities with a shortened version of the name appears in the biblical text, of course, as Ramses. This is Ramses the Great right here, his mummy. Low chronology is a bit of a problem. Low chronology would put the Exodus somewhere at 1267, somewhere in the middle of his reign, so he couldn't also die in the Red Sea. It's also a problem. This would be Moses fleeing during Horemheb's time. So no real problem there, because that means Horemheb would have died long before, a couple more kings would have died before Moses came back. The problem with this one is it puts us back in Moses being born during Akhenaten's period. The reason why this is a problem is because Akhenaten is that monotheistic king. He's the one who decided that there's going to be only one God named Aten, and all other gods were gone. So this is early monotheism. Most Egyptologists who don't study the Bible at all claim that the Hebrews got their idea for monotheism from Akhenaten. So if Akhenaten was the king, monotheism existed when Moses was born, then it's going to be, biblical scholars have to explain how God is real and not just an invention that came from Akhenaten. But if the Exodus event took place before Akhenaten, then Akhenaten's heretic, the monotheism, would have been a reflection of what happened at the Exodus. So that's why it matters who's the king at the time of the Exodus. So this kind of really does matter if Ramses is the king or not. And so it causes a bit of complaint. Also, there's another problem. The Merenptah is that 13th son who came after Ramses. At the bottom of his stele, there's this little bit here that says, Israel's seed is no more. He actually is naming all the Ashkelon and Gaza, all these different places he attacked and destroyed in the southern Levant area. And he mentions Israel, which means the time that Ramses died and Merenptah took over, he had this campaign, Israel already existed in the area, which is going to be a little bit of a problem. This is that wall that I work on every December. Here's the peace treaty that I'm working on. My colleagues and I we're working on this whole wall, mapping it out. There's Gezer, Ashkelon, Israel might be up here, but it's damaged and destroyed. We don't know. Actually, there's some more to be excavated, so we're hoping we'll find the stones soon. But this is the sign of this is Merenptah. We're working on his wall at Karnak, and all the places he said he attacked, including Israel, are all up here, except we don't have the word Israel. We have people here that are very different looking than everybody else, and so all of us think that it probably is Israel, but we need the text to say it, and we don't have the text to say it yet. Also, a Berlin pedestal is a bit of a problem. This is a pedestal that mentions Ashkelon, it mentions Canaan, and it mentions Israel. It's kind of damaged, but it mentions Israel. This is late 18th dynasty, which means Israel existed in the land of Canaan already before Ramses became king. So how could they have been in Exodus, coming out of the Exodus, if they already existed in the Levant area at that time? So there's a lot of archaeological evidence that doesn't seem to support very well Ramses, although there's enough that does, that makes us kind of wonder. Who's the Pharaoh of the Exodus? I can't tell you the answer, but I'll tell you who I think it is. So I'll be fair to you and give you an answer. Of the three candidates, again, I have friends that believe all of these. I believe that Amenhotep is the Pharaoh of the Exodus because, and for this reason only, there's other reasons, but he's the only candidate who himself was not a firstborn. See, when we get to the 10th plague, it says the firstborn would die in the 10th plague. We always think about children, but it wasn't children, it was also adults. If you're a firstborn adult, you also die. So if Pharaoh was on the throne and Pharaoh himself was firstborn, then God would have had to do something special to him and not let him die. And maybe God, of course God could have done that. But the text doesn't mention anything about that at all. It seems to me that the candidate who fits best is the one who himself was not a firstborn, who also had a son who was not, well, all of them had sons who ruled after them who were not firstborns. So he's the only one who was himself not a firstborn. And that kind of cinches it for me, but there's other reasons too. It also fits perfectly into in this middle one here, which is what I also believe. It also fits really, really well with this here, meaning that when the family moved back to the land, when Ramses' family moved back up here and rebuilt the old city, they named it after Ramses. They were naming it after a name that already existed earlier, Pithem and Ramses, which is, I think, it's fascinating. We can talk more about that in questions and answers if you want more. But so for the way I see the Exodus event, and again, if you don't see it this way, we can still be friends. But the way I see it is that Amenhotep was Pharaoh of the Exodus. His father died before. His father was the one who wanted to kill him in the sermon from the sermon this morning, and he died in the process of time. A couple of years before the Exodus, he dies, and then God goes to Moses and says, "Now's the time for you to go back." The dynastic line has already been solidified. Nobody's going to want you dead because you can no longer be king. Because it's already been passed now to another son, it can no longer be you. And so that's why nobody wanted him to die. It also fits pretty well with all these other things here, I think, pretty well. The only problem is the Red Sea crossing. We'll come back to that in a second. Pharaoh as the golden horse. Of course, I told you earlier, the skin of the gods is gold. And so because he was a living God, he had the golden horse name. He considered himself a god. And so we come to this question. Does it have something here with the hardening of the heart? It says in Exodus 8:32, there's actually three different ways you can understand the hardening. It says that Pharaoh hardened his heart, it says that God hardened his heart, and it says his heart was hardened. There's three different ways. So who hardened the heart of Pharaoh? Was it Pharaoh or was it God? The best answer I've ever heard comes from Spurgeon. There might be better explanations, and if you have one, I'd like to hear it because I like to get more ideas. But Spurgeon likened it to what the Hebrews were doing there. They were making mud bricks. And your mud bricks, you make the mud brick, and you set it out in the sun, and the sun hardens it. Right? We all know what happens to butter if you put butter out in the sun. It melts. So here you have the sun hardening one substance, but melting another substance. It's the same sun. Moses and Pharaoh grew up, whoever the Pharaoh was, grew up in the same palace. They both were trained. They trained in all of the Egyptian arts, dark arts, everything, military, everything. Yet that when God called Moses, his heart melted. When God called Pharaoh, he hardened. So you could say that God melted Moses' heart and hardened Pharaoh's heart, or you could also say that the human free will that God gives us, which is one of the best gifts God ever gives us the ability to choose to respond. And Moses continually responded by softening, and Pharaoh continually responded by hardening. So Pharaoh did harden his heart, but God also hardened it. But God, because he was the acting agent, not the deciding factor in it. And that's how I understand it. If you have another way of understanding that, I'd love to hear your understanding of how that works. God said, for this purpose I've raised you up. That doesn't mean God raises you up to fail. God knew what he was going to do, and he needed somebody that was going to do it. Because remember, this goes, if you invite me back, and I did get an invitation to come back, so I don't know if that's good or bad news for you, but I did get an invitation. Hopefully we'll come back. I'll talk about the plagues. When we do the plagues, I'll ask this question to you, but I'll ask it now because it may be a year from now when I come back. I'll ask you the question now. A God who can send plagues one at a time, could that same God send all 10 at one time? So why would he send plagues one at a time? It wasn't for punishment purposes. He didn't need to send any plagues at all. He could just freeze everybody and take the Hebrews out, right? Nothing done. Walk away, clean. But he chose to do the plagues because he wants to show the Egyptians and the Hebrews who a real God is. And he needed a king on the throne who would resist long enough to allow him to show everybody what a real God was. Remember the hail, the plague of hail? Remember when Moses appeared before Pharaoh? And Pharaoh said, I want this to go away. And Moses said, okay, I'll do it, but I'm going to walk out of the city first. So he walks out through the hail that everybody's destroying everybody, killing everything. He walks through the hail, goes outside the city, and then he prays, and God stops the hail immediately. That's the relationship that God wanted the Egyptians to understand. Wanted the Hebrews to understand that too, that God is real in our lives, and he needed somebody on the throne who would be able to allow that to happen. And certainly this arrogant guy was able to do that for him. So did Pharaoh die in the Red Sea? Well, it's hard to know. The Psalm, Exodus doesn't say it, by the way. Psalm 136:15 says, but overthrew Pharaoh and his army in the Red Sea, for his mercy endures forever. The problem is the word for overthrow doesn't mean kill. The same word overthrown is used by David in a psalm earlier, just a few psalms earlier, what God did to him. God overthrew me, David said. Well, God didn't kill David. But he did overthrow his nature, his power, his authority, and humbled him. And certainly if Pharaoh didn't die in the Red Sea, then that would have happened to him. We'll get that later. It depends on what overthrow means, but it also depends on where the Red Sea is. And we'll do that when I come back a year from now. We'll talk about that some more. But Pharaoh dying in the Red Sea. Ellen White mentions it in an article she wrote many, many years later where she says Pharaoh died in the Red Sea. So it's possible he died in the Red Sea. Amenhotep, if Amenhotep was a Pharaoh of the Exodus, Amenhotep had a completely different personality. The personality at the time of the Exodus was ruthless. Most of his career was a benevolent ruler. If you read history books about Egypt, you'll read history books about him being loved and being a great, peaceful king. Well, he wasn't a peaceful king earlier on. So what does that mean? Does that mean that he didn't die in the Red Sea? That he died in essence in the Red Sea, but then survived and was completely humbled and became a different person, and maybe we'll see him in heaven? Praise God, that'd be great. Or does it mean that he did die in the Red Sea and another person stood up in his place? The thing about Amenhotep is when he died, the Amenhotep who died at the end of his reign in 1422 or thereabouts, there was a dynastic crisis at the end of his life. They didn't know who should be the next king. But he had a son, the fourth Tutmos. Why wouldn't you know? He's the only living king. Well, if his uncle, Amenhotep's brother, also named Amenhotep, became king in his place, then he would want his own son to rule. He'd ruled for like 20-something years. The first Amenhotep II, whoever died in the Red Sea, would only have ruled for about 7 to 9 years. They wouldn't have ruled very long. So he didn't rule very long. I've stood in his place. I want my son on the throne. It explains maybe how that dynastic crisis would have come about. It's all speculation. Anyway, we don't know if Pharaoh died in the Red Sea. He could have died. He could not also not have died. It's hard really to know if Ellen White was saying, I saw this in vision, or if she was just saying something that was common belief. It's hard to know. So whether you believe he died in the Red Sea or not, we can still be friends. I don't really know myself. I have no idea. I suspect he did die in the Red Sea, but I don't really know. Where's the Red Sea? We'll do that next time. You invite me back a year from now, we'll do that one. We'll pause on that for a long, long time. All right. I'll open up the questions. We've been here long enough. Any questions? Yes. So if they haven't been unwrapped, if they're wrapped, and the bandages will have the names on it, on the wrappings. Yeah, on the coffins themselves sometimes. It'll be like that. That's typically how they know. Although they've been doing a lot with DNA now. So obviously, the more science that goes by, I can get pretty geeky about it because I like that kind of stuff an awful lot. You get into all that DNA and mapping and stuff, and you can do all kinds of things. I just saw an article in the news just yesterday where I guess they're solving a bunch of cold cases in America. I don't know if you've heard about this, but they found some really, they're able to work with DNA in a way that is new. They were able to actually map out a person's ancestry and be able to solve these cold cases. Well, that same kind of technology, very soon, if it hasn't been used already, will also start being used here, and we start mapping out some of these mummies, which is pretty cool. The Egyptian government has been very, very good, by the way, in preserving and protecting these from scientific experiments. So they're very, very careful, and if you want to do an experiment, it has to be done by professionals and oversawn, so that's all done very respectfully, and they do a good job. But yeah, that's also another way to make people tell those things. It's been a long time. My feet are tired. I'm sure you probably are tired listening. Your ears are tired trying to keep up with me. Yes, my friend.
Into the hole, right?
Yeah.
So when they were building the pyramids, didn't
Yes.
it rain then? And did they just have to keep, I mean, how did they keep it from?
The sand from coming in.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think they built temporary walls to try to keep the area around from the sand getting too bad. But they would have had to have constantly be sweeping it, constantly been blowing it back, and that kind of thing. And any rain, it would have been devastating. It would set work back for some time. They could clean it off. But yeah, they didn't rain very often. It's very, very rare. It happens, every 10, 20 years. That's a long time.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that's a good question. Right behind here. No. Did you have a question? Just stretching. It's okay. Never mind. Over here then.
I don't know how good of a question this is, but
Doesn't matter.
does bother me. How come they have like the bowl on the back of their head? Why is there a big bump back here, like a cone head in the back?
Up here, in here? In here or on this picture here?
Well, on those mummies.
On the mummies. Let's go back to a mummy. You can show me.
It's like their head doesn't go down. It's like their pillow is like a bump on the back of their head.
Let's see if we can find one real quick.
Right there.
Oh.
What is that
Like
about?
this here?
Yeah.
It's the back of the skull, and actually probably what's happened here is the skull probably ends like someplace here.
Yeah.
And all this hair is kind of matted together with some resin because they would actually use people didn't smell very well in the ancient world. They didn't take baths all the time. They didn't have all the soaps and the nice things that we use today. But what they would do is if you're really rich and you had a party and you want to have all your fancy girlfriends over for your party or whatever, everyone coming in gets a nice little cone of wax that's perfumed on their head. So as the night goes on, that wax melts into your hair and the perfume goes out, so you don't have to smell body odor from everybody. So when they were buried, they were also buried with these cones of wax that also melted, and oftentimes that gets in there. And probably what you're seeing back here is hair being kind of matted together in the process. And also the mummy wrapping process all had a lot of resin in it.
So did the guys have a different kind of essential wax to go
No.
under their head?
I don't think so. I think it's all the same. At least as far as I know, it's the same.
Oh, I just had to know.
Yeah, it's good. It's a good question. Yeah.
Our daughter went to Egypt in like 80 or something like that. Went to the Cairo Museum, and she'd been raised going to art museums and history museums over here. And her biggest comment was, "Wow, they let you touch everything in there. I mean, the stuff is just sitting out. There's a guard at the door, but nobody seems to care. Things have changed, right?"
So yeah, okay. Two answers to that question. One, the Cairo Museum is like a warehouse.
Yeah.
It's so unusual. They are much more protective now than they have been in the past. Praise God for that. But they've also built a new museum called the Grand Egyptian Museum that's been in the works for a decade, more than a decade. It's supposed to have been opened last year. I think it's opening this year, and that's going to be a modern museum. And things behind glass, and you can't touch things. And even the stone there, you're not supposed to be able to touch. But even I was there in December last year, and you can touch almost anything in the Cairo Museum still. It's unbelievable. Yeah. Now, the Cairo Museum, they're actually doing excavations of the Cairo Museum's basement because it's so filled with mud and everything that they're actually finding things that were found years earlier, but nobody knows where it came from. So they're actually excavating the basement of the Cairo Museum. There's so many things that it's crazy. And there is so much stuff there. It's so much stuff.
I have another question. Our daughter is into she thinks it's stealing when you take something from another country and bring it like to the Chicago Museum or whatever. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, so I told a story a little earlier to Mr. Carlson. And so I was actually in University College London in England. And we had, for one of our questions for our essay, the question came, do you believe that all objects should be repatriated back to the original countries? And I was thinking about this as I was going through, and I was thinking, because I'm thinking as a teacher, right? These questions are recycled every 5 years or so. They come back to the same question. So this same teacher has seen this question and answers for this so many times. And the right answer to give is yes. And so I know almost all of my classmates are going to say yes, and their papers are going to look just the same. So I thought, I'm going to say no so that it's unique. Maybe I'll get a better grade than if I just try to parrot something everybody else is saying. So I said no, they shouldn't. And so I argued a couple different reasons, and then I found myself believing myself. So I don't know. For one point, I believe that, okay, so what belongs to ancient Egypt? Modern Egypt is not ancient Egypt. So the governments are not even related in any whatsoever. The religion isn't related. Nothing. There's no direct line down. There's even a lot of debate whether the Egyptians themselves today were the same ethnicity as the ancient Egyptians. Now, I don't argue that because I think there's good evidence that maybe they are. But setting that aside, we don't really know for sure. But what we do know, the Rosetta Stone, for example, was made in Egypt during the Ptolemaic period when the Greeks were in control. So does the Rosetta Stone belong to Greece or does it belong to Egypt? Well, what about when Thutmose, the third Thutmose, went on that campaign into the Levant area up into Syria? And he got into Syria and he put a stele up there. Does that belong to Syria or does that belong to Egypt? So you get these kind of questions and it gets to be pretty tricky. How do you know? And then how do you know who it goes back to? So something that was made by the Romans in Jerusalem, does that belong to Israel or does that belong to Italy? And how would you, and who would decide that? It gets to be pretty complicated. I also decided, I said, if you put everything, say everything goes back to whatever place it was recovered. Some of those things are found on black markets. You don't know where they came from. But let's just say they all go back to their countries. They make it simple. And then you put them all in one big museum, and then a terrorist comes like ISIS and blows up all the Buddhists in Mesopotamia. And they blow it all up, and then you don't have anything. So actually having it spread out keeps it safe. And then I also argued that if it's spread out, it also creates tourism opportunities for people who don't get a chance to see that country and maybe get excited and maybe someday travel there and give you all their money when they go as tourists. So it actually helps the country better to have that in someplace else. Plus, it also raises awareness for your country by you arguing about it all the time. And so I actually say, no, they shouldn't go back. They shouldn't go back for all those reasons.
I have another question, and I don't want to be...
Oh, by the way, I got an A.
Good.
She didn't agree with me, but she said, this is really well argued. I can't argue against it, so I think you're wrong. But yes, A. So my strategy worked. For any students in the room, that'll help you in the future.
This question has to do with when you were digging over there, when you go in December and dig. Have you ever been hurt on your digging escapades?
Yeah, I've been nicked up or whatever, and thorns and cuts and things like that. But every once in a while, somebody gets a hand smashed or something by rocks if you're not careful. But we wear gloves, so we're very careful. When I'm in Egypt, I've never been hurt because I'm not actually digging. I'm just working on I'm on a project that's doing hieroglyphs, so it's more mental kind of work. If I fell off that scaffolding, I could probably get hurt.
Or but rock on your head.
Yeah. But I have a very good wife. That's the right answer. And she bought me a pith helmet. So there's one year earlier I was digging in Jordan. I was digging in this deep room, and it's a very unstable room. And they wanted me to wear a construction hat. I'm an archaeologist. I can't wear a plastic hat on my head. So my wife said, well, I'll get you a pith helmet. And so I wore a pith helmet, and one day a rock did fall. And it hit my pith helmet, crushed the pith helmet, but my head was saved. I was fine because of my wife. So there's been chances where I could have gotten hurt, but I haven't. People sprain their ankles and things like that kind of thing, but it's fun. By the way, we're doing a dig. I take this chance to mention it. Every summer, Andrews University goes on a dig. This year, we're going to go back to Jordan, the country of Jordan. We're digging at a place called Khirbet Safra. Pastor's been to it, so he can tell you about it some more if you want to ask him. It's a single occupation site. It comes from the time of Saul, David, or Solomon. So one of those three guys were ruling over in Jerusalem while this city that we're working at was being occupied. It occupies a route that goes down to the Jordan, across the Jordan to Jericho. So there's a kind of merchant way. What they would do is as you come into a city, You go into the city for free, but the only way you go out of a city is if you pay a tax. They're very clever. So you go in for free, you pay a tax to get out, and then they can kind of control who's going on the trade routes. And so we're digging this, and it's right across you see the Dead Sea every day is right there. Jerusalem, when the light comes up, the sun comes up in the morning, it hits the glass windows in Jerusalem. It's like all the lights in Jerusalem pop on in the morning. And so we go there for a couple of weeks. I'm taking the academy students with me from Andrew's Academy, but we also have adult volunteers that come with us as well from all over the country. From all over the world, we have people coming. Croatia, Russia, all over the place. We tour on the weekends, actually Friday, which is a Muslim holiday, and Sabbath, we tour to biblical sites and see biblical things. And then from Sunday through Thursday, we excavate at this site. So you get a chance to actually dig and get some dirty or whatever. We do that. So what we're going to do is we're going to go have the first weekend tour. We're going to go down to the Dead Sea, the baptismal site of Jesus, and see some things like that. And then we'll see Mount Nebo, which is right there where Moses died. You can actually stand on Mount Nebo and see somewhere in this area Moses died, because this is Mount Nebo. And we'll see that. Then we'll dig for a week. And then the second week, we'll go down to Petra. And we'll see Petra for a weekend. And we'll go hike all around there, see a couple of things, some Crusaders' castles and things along the way. And then we'll dig one more week. And then everybody who wants to go home could go home. But those who want, for pay a little extra, can go down to a trip to Egypt. We'll cross over for the Gulf of Aqaba, cross over to Sinai, go up Mount Sinai, go to Cairo, see the pyramids, and see a few other things. And that's what we're going to do in this stuff. So if you're interested in that, contact me, and I'll give you the information as it comes out. I think it's something like $1,000 a week for volunteers. But they're giving some donor has come in to pay for academy students. So letting academy students do it for $400 a week. For 2 weeks, and it's a great deal. So you pay your airfare, you pay the dig fee, and then which by the way covers all the tourist sites. And you get to swim in the Dead Sea. You float in the Dead Sea. It's amazing. And you do all that, and then you can go home or you can come with us to Egypt for another fee or whatever. That's up to you. So anyway, if you want to join us and see what a dig is like, ask Pastor. He'll tell you about his experience. He was over there with me one time, and we had a great time. And we would love to have you. We'd love it. You were there for 5-6 weeks. How long were you? 45 days he was over there. So he did the full, complete thing. We're just going to do ours for a couple of weeks and come back because we can't get off work that much. So that's why. Yeah. Yes. Yes. So that stone was used to great effect in Egypt. Tutankhamun's golden mask, the blue part, that's lapis lazuli. It was used quite a lot. There was actually three colors associated with a king: red, purple, and blue. By the way, the same 3 colors of thread in the sanctuary. It's a different topic, but just something to keep in your mind. And the purple one there is kind of the reflection of the lapis lazuli, the dark blue. Turquoise is that light blue, and then carnelian is usually the one for the red. And those are the gems they use. But then they would also use faience, the kind of glass that they'd make. They also make those same 3 colors. Those are the colors of the king. And so lapis lazuli was used in a lot of things associated with the king because of that. Yeah.
So I have one more question. I'm really not sure how to ask this. So sure. We really don't know where the Egyptians lived that were enslaving Israel, right? I mean, because if you knew, and if you did the digs and you could see there was multiple deaths because of all the firstborn and all the animals and everything dying, then you'd be able to pinpoint who the Pharaoh was at that time.
So yeah, good question. And actually, we do know where the pharaohs where they lived, and we do have infant burials. In fact, there's a ton of children that are buried, boys that are buried along the walls of houses at that time period. A lot of animal burials at that time period. In fact, at this time period, there's actually something called the Asiatic disease. It's written in a medical papyri that mentions an Asiatic disease, and that matches up very well with that pestilence plague. So I used to say for years and years and years, I used to say that there's no evidence for the Exodus because that's what I was always taught. And then I became Egyptian archaeologist, and I realized there's evidence all over the place. I mean, it doesn't cinch it down, but you put enough of these data points together, and it presents a pretty compelling case. So could it have happened? It absolutely could have happened because we actually do have those kind of things. And we actually are using, again, going back to technology, we're actually using satellite imagery to use infrared and some other techniques. We actually can, without digging anything now, we can actually map out entire Egyptian cities underground without digging anything now, using some of these remote sensing techniques. It's quite remarkable. So now we can dig more strategically and do more things. So there actually is evidence of it. So if you say you can't pass over the valley of the kings was buried at one time? No. So the Valley of Kings was always a valley, but there were certain parts of it that were I mean, it was all covered up. So they put their tombs in certain places, and sometimes those tombs were covered up by the wash that came down from the floods or whatever.
Do you have an opinion or evidence about the Pharaoh at the time of Joseph?
You asked that earlier, right? Sorry, yeah, good. Glad you came back to it. Joseph, right. So Joseph, there's two things with Joseph. Obviously, we talked about it last night about how long they were in Egypt. So was Joseph the Pharaoh, was Joseph in Egypt during the time of the second intermediate period? Or was it back further to the 430 years, all in Egypt, and putting it back to the Middle Kingdom? So I would suggest that if you look at the Joseph story and you see chariots, he's riding a chariot. Chariots didn't exist in Egypt till the second intermediate period. When in the buying back of the territory during the time of Joseph, bought all of Egypt, bought the horses, cattle, all these things. He bought horses. Horses didn't exist in Egypt until the second intermediate period. So there's a lot of those kind of things. You start putting these pieces together and you realize maybe all these little pieces of data together are pointing towards a time period when there were rulers on the throne that were actually Asiatic and they were not Egyptian. They looked very much Egyptian. Remember, when Joseph's brothers come into Egypt, they come in and they meet with Joseph, but they don't think anything odd about it. Well, Joseph is Asiatic. He's not Egyptian. Egyptians are much more reddish. Asiatics are much paler. The Hebrews are much paler people. So why would he not think anything? If there's Asiatic people, Hyksos ruling on the throne at the time, it would have been very common to find a second in command, the vizier, to be also Asiatic. They would have thought nothing about it. He looked Egyptian. He had talked to a translator. They wouldn't have recognized his voice. And it had been quite a few years. But he recognized them because they still looked like what he remembered them as looking like. So it's a lot of things. It mentions, so Joseph was sold to Potiphar, an Egyptian. Well, why does it have, I mean, it's a tough argument, but put together, why would you say un-Egyptian? He's the captain of the bodyguard of Pharaoh. Well, that would be very significant if he's an Egyptian if the Pharaoh himself was not Egyptian, because he's a very loyal person. I mean, why would Potiphar's wife want this servant who's risen up in a house? She's married to the captain of the bodyguard of the Pharaoh. Unless he's Asiatic and he's on his way up, and she's wanting to also go up. There's a lot of things that don't by themselves make an argument. Start putting them together, and it starts to add up a lot. Joseph goes in. Joseph brings all the brothers in to eat the meal. Right? They're all eating the meal, and Joseph is sitting by himself, and the Egyptians are sitting by themselves. He's not sitting with the Egyptians. Why was that not odd? So there's a lot of these little things that make me think that maybe second intermediate period probably was, which means that you look at the pharaohs, the second intermediate period. We don't know a lot about them because it was this in-between period of time, not a lot of archaeological evidence. But there's that one king named Cayenne who got control of all of Egypt during a time of a famine, and so I think he probably was the pharaoh of Joseph's time. But that's complete. Me taking this and this, and I can't draw a line between them, but they sound very similar, so I can kind of put them over top of each other and suggest it. Speculation, though. Please don't write that down.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask. Yeah. Is there any evidence? Because obviously the biblical story, it sounds as though power was spread out amongst the nomarchs or whatever, and then all of a sudden they shrank down, and all of a sudden the pharaoh became very, very wealthy. Right. And then secondly, of course, with a famine that severe, there would have been so much travel, and you would think that somebody would record something like that. I'm curious if there's any evidence of that nature.
So two answers to that. The first one about the recording of it. The Egyptians didn't record history. What they did was they put events that they want to remember and to be repeated in stone. They believed in something called prescribed reality. So you etch it into stone, and then it's as if it will happen forever in perpetuity. So in a tomb, you'd write on the tomb a gift of 1,000 geese, 1,000 linen, 1,000 ox, 1,000 beer, and you're giving a votive offering to the dead person who's dead. But you're not actually bringing that into the tomb all the time. by putting it on the wall, it happens automatically. And so on all these temples and palaces, you see the tombs, you see what's on the wall. That's not history, that's prescribed future reality. They want this to continue to exist. And so you're not going to get Pharaoh being destroyed by somebody. You're going to see Pharaoh destroying his enemies because they want that to happen over and over and over again. They don't want to be destroyed over and over again. So you're not going to have a lot of history. And the only way you're going to have anything written down that reflects history would be on a papyrus scroll, which doesn't exist a whole lot because it was a very wet country. It's organic, and so it disintegrates. But even then, hey, they didn't write a lot of history. They didn't write a lot of history, so you're probably not going to have any of that kind of written down. The reason why you dig in Jordan and Israel and you won't find very much writing is because they didn't believe in prescribed reality. They believe God prescribes reality. And so there's no reason to write that on a wall. So we don't have a lot of written materials in those countries. But Egypt, because of the way they believe, they have a lot of written materials, but it's nothing, it's useful, but its own way. You know, we piece things together, but it's not useful in that kind of a way. Yeah. Yeah. I'm glad you asked that question. That's a very good one to answer. Anything else? Anything from online? Nope. All right. Thank you, everybody watching online. Thank you, Duluth, for inviting us here. We hope to see you again in a year from now sometime. I'll come back. We'll talk about the plagues of Egypt. We'll talk about the route of the Exodus. And I'll talk about the golden calf and what happened at Sinai at that time. And it'd be very good to see you then.
Thank you, Dr. Baker Jr. We really appreciate your time here. And we pray that may God continue to bless you and bless your ministry. We have learned a lot today, and we have been blessed. When you go home, please give my regards to the Michiana Philam Church, to everybody. All right, they are well missed in my life. Thank you so much. And then Arnie Baker, thank you for being here alongside your husband. And then I know that's been a great help when you have your wife with you on the road. And then we do have people who come from really far. We have some, a couple come from 3.5 hours away from Hutchinson. And we pray that and hope this was a blessing to you and your family. And also for those watching online, still this time at the Q&A, question and answer, we still have a lot of people watching and listening to your questions and answers. Thank you so much, everyone. And then I ask that you keep him in prayer as he drives back to Michigan. All right? There's something we usually do, and they may not like when I do it, but we usually ask our guests to turn around, and by wave of hand, we just wave to show our appreciation and thank you for being here with us. Just look around and everyone is waving. Thank you. That's the love, everyone in here have for you. And I'm sure the one online just did it too. I believe that because I'm a believer. Okay? And I have asked one of our inactive Elder Keith, to take us out in a prayer. And then thank you so much. Give my regards to your daughters, and then may God continue to bless your ministry. Thank you, audiovisual, and thank you, everyone who make this evening an experience. God bless you.